Good evening, and welcome back to Bedtime and Historian. Have you ever wondered how a young man from a narrow island city, surrounded by water and merchant noise, came to know more of the world than almost anyone of his time, and how his memories would quietly reshape how entire continents imagined one another? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you'd like, tell me where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the middle of the 13th century, the world was far larger than most people could imagine, and at the same time, far more connected than later generations would expect. Europe was a patchwork of city-states, kingdoms, and bishoprics, where news travelled slowly and most lives unfolded within a few miles of where they began. To the east, across mountains, deserts, and seas, stretched regions known more through rumour than knowledge. Names like Cathay and Cipangu floated through ports and marketplaces, detached from geography and filled with exaggeration. Between these worlds lay distances measured not only in miles, but in years. Venice, where Marco Polo was born in 1254, was one of the few places where those distances felt slightly shorter. The city rose from the water like a careful compromise between land and sea. Its wealth did not come from fields or castles, but from movement ships arriving, ships departing, goods changing hands, languages mixing in the air. Spices, silks, metals, and stories passed through the same narrow canals. A child growing up there absorbed, without instruction, the idea that the world was wide and that opportunity often arrived from beyond the horizon. Marco's family belonged to this commercial world. They were not nobles, nor were they poor. They were merchants, and that placed them in a category defined by calculation, patience, and risk. Trade required memory and attention. Weights, measures, debts, favours, seasons. It also required endurance. Journeys were long, profit uncertain, and danger accepted as part of the work. For Marco, travel was not introduced as adventure. It was simply what adults did when business required it. By the time Marco was old enough to form lasting memories, his father Niccolo and his uncle Maffeo had already left Venice on a journey that would carry them far beyond familiar routes. Their absence was not unusual, but it was significant. Years passed before they returned, bringing with them not just goods, but knowledge of lands under Mongol rule, where a single political authority stretched across enormous distances. They returned speaking of order where Europeans expected chaos, and of rulers who valued information as much as conquest. The Mongol Empire, at that time, was the largest contiguous empire the world had known. Its power rested not only on military force, but on administration, communication, and the protection of trade routes. Messengers travelled with official seals, inns were maintained along roads, and merchants could move with a degree of security unknown in earlier centuries. For a merchant family from Venice, this was not merely interesting, it was transformative. When Marco was still a boy, his father and uncle prepared to leave again, this time intending to return east with messages and gifts. This journey would not be brief. It would take years, and its destination lay far beyond anything Marco had yet imagined. This time, however, Marco would go with them. The decision was not framed as heroic or dramatic, it was practical. He was of age to learn, to observe, and to be useful. The road would become his education. The departure from Venice did not mark a sharp emotional break in the way later stories would suggest. There was no grand farewell scene, no sense that Marco believed he might never return. Travel was familiar, and expectations were modest. The road was long, but the world, as he knew it, was open. He carried with him the habits of a merchant household, attention, adaptability, and the ability to notice what mattered. As the journey unfolded, time began to stretch. Movement eastward was slow and often interrupted. Political conditions shifted, weather intervened, illness delayed progress. Roads were not lines but sequences of pauses. Cities appeared as islands of stability between empty spaces. Marco learned early that distance was not something conquered all at once, but absorbed gradually through repetition and patience. The world he entered was not uniform. Languages changed every few weeks. Clothing, food, and customs shifted subtly, then abruptly. Marco did not experience these differences as curiosities to be judged. They were facts to be understood. This quiet attentiveness would later shape how he described what he saw, not as a collector of marvels, but as someone noting how things worked. The farther east they travelled, the clearer it became that they were moving through lands governed by a system unlike anything in Europe. Authority did not depend on castles or hereditary claims alone. It was maintained through delegation, records, and expectation. Officials were appointed, reassigned, and removed. Taxes were assessed with precision. Roads were maintained because they served the state. For Marco, still young, this order did not feel abstract. It appeared in practical ways. The availability of lodging, the reliability of guides, the predictability of certain rules. He was not yet aware that these observations would later challenge European assumptions about governance and civilization. For now, they simply made travel possible. As months turned into years, Marco's sense of origin softened. Venice remained real, but distant. The world immediately around him demanded attention. He learned to recognize patterns, how markets functioned, how local officials interacted with travelers, how information moved faster in some regions than others. He noticed how power was displayed not always through force, but through routine. When they finally reached the heart of Mongol-controlled territory, Marco entered a political and cultural environment shaped by deliberate design. The court of the Great Khan was not chaotic or exotic in the way later readers would imagine. It was orderly, multilingual, and efficient. Visitors were observed carefully. Information was valued. Curiosity was encouraged, but within limits. Marco's youth worked in his favor. He was not burdened by expectations. He listened more than he spoke. He learned by watching how others behaved, what was rewarded, and what was ignored. Over time, this attentiveness made him useful. He became someone who could be sent, trusted, and relied upon to report accurately. At no point in these early years did Marco imagine himself as a figure of history. His life unfolded without awareness of its later significance. He was a participant, not an interpreter. He did not yet know that memory would become his most important instrument, or that recollection, shaped by time and distance, would later turn experience into narrative. The era itself was one of movement and connection. Even as many regions remained isolated, goods travelled farther than people. Ideas moved unevenly. The Mongol peace, as later historians would call it, created conditions for exchange that were fragile and temporary. Marco lived within this window, benefiting from its stability without knowing how rare it was. By the end of this early phase of his life, Marco had already crossed boundaries that few Europeans ever would. Not boundaries marked on maps, but those defined by expectation. He had learned that the world was not organized according to a single center, and that order could exist in unfamiliar forms. These lessons were not framed as revelations. They accumulated quietly, like entries in a ledger. This is where his story truly begins, not with spectacle or wonder, but with observation, patience, and the steady widening of perspective. What followed would deepen these qualities, testing them across distance, responsibility, and time. The road ahead was long, and Marco continued forward not with anticipation of fame, but with the simple understanding that the journey was not yet finished. Venice in the middle of the 13th century was not a city that explained itself. It revealed its character slowly, through repetition and routine. For a child growing up within its narrow corridors of water and stone, the city did not present itself as extraordinary. It was simply the environment in which daily life unfolded. Yet nearly every aspect of that environment prepared Marco Polo, quietly and without instruction, for a life shaped by movement, exchange, and observation. The Polo household was defined by absence as much as presence. Marco's father and uncle were often away, sometimes for years at a time, following commercial routes that extended beyond the Adriatic and into the eastern Mediterranean and farther still. Their departures were not treated as emotional events. They were understood as part of the rhythm of mercantile life. Ships came and went. Men left and returned changed, carrying with them both profit and experience. For Marco, this meant that travel was never associated with instability or danger alone. It was associated with responsibility. Venice itself reinforced this outlook. Unlike inland cities, it did not draw its wealth from surrounding farmland. Everything depended on movement. Grain arrived by ship, timber came from distant forests. Metals, fabrics, spices, and dyes passed through warehouses, were weighed, assessed, taxed, and redistributed. The city functioned as an intermediary, and its people learned early that value often lay in connection rather than possession. Markets were the true classrooms of the city. They were noisy but orderly, governed by customs understood by all participants. Bargaining followed recognizable patterns. Disputes were settled through established mechanisms rather than force. Trust mattered, but so did record-keeping. Contracts were drawn, witnesses named, debts acknowledged. For a young Marco, watching these interactions, the idea that human systems could regulate complex exchange became normal. Language in Venice was fluid. Latin served official functions. Venetian dialect shaped daily speech. Greek, Arabic, and Slavic words surfaced in conversations about trade. Sailors and merchants from distant regions brought accents and unfamiliar phrases. Marco absorbed this multilingual environment without conscious effort. He learned early that communication did not require perfection, only attentiveness and willingness to adapt. Religion shaped the city, but it did not dominate every conversation. Churches were present everywhere, their bells marking time. Festivals punctuated the year. Yet Venice's prosperity depended on dealing with people of different faiths. This produced a practical tolerance that differed from theological debates elsewhere in Europe. For Marco, this meant that difference was not immediately equated with threat. It was something to be navigated. The Polo family occupied a modest but stable position within this world. They were not among the most powerful families, but they were respected. Their wealth was tied up in ventures that required foresight and patience. Profit was rarely immediate. Investments took years to mature. Losses were expected and absorbed. This cultivated a mindset oriented toward long horizons rather than quick results. Marco's early education, such as it was, reflected this environment. Formal schooling was limited. Literacy was functional rather than scholarly. What mattered was the ability to read contracts, understand numbers, and follow correspondence. Memory was trained through necessity. Names, routes, prices, and obligations had to be recalled accurately. Errors were costly. As Marco grew older, the absence of his father and uncle became more noticeable, but not more troubling. Their stories, when they returned, were not embellished. They spoke of roads, customs, and rulers with the same tone they used to describe cargo and exchange rates. The extraordinary was treated as factual, not dramatic. This manner of recounting left a deep impression on Marco. He learned that accuracy mattered more than excitement. The return of Niccolo and Maffeo, after their first long eastern journey, marked a subtle shift in Marco's life. They brought with them not only goods, but credibility. They had been received by powerful rulers. They had travelled under protection granted by distant authority. Their experience expanded the family's sense of what was possible. The world was no longer divided simply into known and unknown. It had gradations of familiarity. Within the household, preparations for future journeys were discussed openly. Routes were traced mentally. Risks were assessed. Decisions were weighed. Marco listened. He learned how adults thought about uncertainty not with fear, but with calculation. Danger was not denied. It was managed through information and alliances. This exposure shaped Marco's temperament. He did not grow into a restless child seeking escape. He grew into an attentive one, curious but measured. He learned to watch before acting, to listen before speaking. These habits would later allow him to navigate unfamiliar courts and customs without causing offense. Venice also offered lessons in governance. Though not a monarchy, the city maintained stability through councils, offices, and laws. Power was distributed carefully to avoid concentration. Decisions were recorded, precedent mattered. For Marco, this demonstrated that authority could function through systems rather than personalities alone. This understanding would later help him recognize similar patterns in very different political contexts. The city's geography reinforced the importance of infrastructure. Canals had to be maintained, bridges repaired. Navigation required knowledge of tides and channels. Coordination was essential. These were not abstract concepts, they were visible daily. Marco saw how neglect led to disruption and how maintenance sustained order. As he approached adolescence, Marco became more involved in practical tasks. He assisted with correspondence. He accompanied family associates to docks and warehouses. He learned how to evaluate goods, not by appearance alone, but by origin and handling. These experiences trained his observational skills. He learned to notice small details that signaled quality or risk. At the same time, Venice exposed him to stories that stretched beyond immediate experience. Sailors spoke of storms, distant ports, and unfamiliar peoples. These accounts varied in reliability. Some were exaggerated, others were cautious. Marco learned to distinguish between speculation and observation. He noticed which speakers relied on hearsay and which described what they had seen. This skill would later shape his own approach to recounting events. The absence of rigid social hierarchy within the merchant class also influenced Marco. Status was fluid. Success could elevate a family, failure could diminish it. This encouraged pragmatism rather than entitlement. Marco did not grow up expecting deference. He learned to earn trust through competence. When Niccolo and Maffeo began planning their second journey east, the decision to include Marco was not presented as a rite of passage. It was a practical choice. He was old enough to travel. He could learn. He could assist. His presence could strengthen family ties in distant negotiations. For Marco, the prospect was not framed as leaving home forever. It was an extension of what he already understood, that life involved movement and adaptation. The preparation phase was slow. Goods were gathered, letters secured, permissions sought. This period taught Marco that journeys did not begin with departure, they began with organization. He saw how relationships mattered as much as resources. Letters of introduction carried weight. Reputation traveled ahead of the traveler. Venice at this moment stood at a crossroads between worlds. Its merchants acted as intermediaries between Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean. Beyond that lay regions increasingly accessible due to Mongol control. This created a sense, subtle but present, that opportunity lay eastward. Marco absorbed this orientation without ideology. It was simply where business led. As departure approached, Marco did not experience a sharp emotional divide between childhood and adulthood. The transition was gradual. Responsibility increased incrementally. Expectations shifted quietly. This gradualism suited his temperament. He did not seek to prove himself. He sought to understand. The city itself offered no grand farewell. Life continued. Ships departed daily. Venice did not pause for individual journeys. This reinforced the idea that Marco was not stepping into legend. He was stepping into work. The road was an extension of the marketplace. In later years, readers would imagine Marco as a figure driven by wonder. In truth, his early formation emphasized steadiness over astonishment. He learned to accept unfamiliarity without judgment. He learned that systems, once understood, could be navigated. These lessons did not promise comfort, but they offered orientation. By the time Marco left Venice, he carried with him more than supplies. He carried habits shaped by a city built on exchange. He understood that people everywhere organized their lives around needs and constraints. He expected difference, but not disorder. This expectation would prove crucial. The Venice he left behind was already changing. Trade routes shifted. Political pressures mounted. Yet for Marco, the city remained a reference point, a place where complexity was managed through routine. This memory would later color his descriptions of distant administrations, markets, and courts. He would compare not cultures, but functions. As the journey eastward resumed, Marco did not shed his Venetian identity. He carried it quietly, using it as a framework rather than a measure. He did not seek to replicate Venice elsewhere. He sought to understand how other places solved similar problems differently. This grounding allowed him to observe without becoming overwhelmed. When confronted with scale, he noted logistics. When encountering wealth, he noted systems. When witnessing authority, he noted procedure. These habits distinguished his accounts from those driven by marvel or fear. In this way, Marco's merchant routes did more than prepare him materially. They shaped his way of seeing. He moved through the world not as a conqueror or pilgrim, but as an attentive participant. This posture would remain consistent throughout his travels. The road ahead would test these qualities. Distance would stretch patience, responsibility would deepen, yet the foundation laid in Venice would hold. The city had taught him that the world was navigable, not because it was simple, but because it was structured. As Marco followed his father and uncle beyond familiar waters, he did so equipped not with certainty, but with method. He knew how to watch, how to wait, and how to learn. These skills, cultivated quietly in the markets and canals of Venice, would shape everything that followed. The first journey east. The decision to depart Venice and travel eastward again did not arrive with ceremony or public announcement. It unfolded through preparation. Supplies were assembled, letters gathered, obligations settled. The Polo household shifted into a familiar mode of readiness, one that assumed distance and time rather than urgency. For Marco, now a teenager, the journey did not represent a break from life, but a continuation of it under different conditions. They left Venice quietly, moving first along routes that were already known to merchants of the Adriatic and Eastern Mediterranean. Coastal travel eased the transition. Ports appeared at regular intervals, offering markets, lodging, and news. The pace was steady. Weather and political conditions determined movement more than intention. This early stage of the journey reinforced a lesson Marco had already learned. Travel was governed by circumstance. As they moved inland, the character of the journey changed. Roads replaced waterways. The comfort of familiar maritime rhythms gave way to the unpredictability of land routes. Progress slowed. Caravans formed and dissolved depending on safety and opportunity. Marco learned to observe how experienced travelers judged risk, not through speculation, but through signs, the condition of roads, the presence of guards, the flow of goods. The landscapes they crossed varied gradually. Fertile regions gave way to drier terrain. Settlements thinned. Distances between towns increased. Each transition required adjustment. Food changed. Shelter became less reliable. Marco noted how local populations adapted to these conditions, using materials and methods suited to their environment. He did not interpret these differences as markers of advancement or decline. They were responses to necessity. Throughout this stage, Marco remained closely tied to his father and uncle. They guided decisions, negotiated passage, and managed resources. Yet Marco was not merely a passenger. He observed transactions, listened to discussions, and began to understand how trust was established among strangers. He saw how reputation traveled ahead of individuals, carried by letters and prior associations. The farther east they traveled, the more apparent it became that they were moving into regions shaped by Mongol authority. This presence did not always announce itself through visible force. Often it appeared through consistency. Rules were applied uniformly. Officials recognized seals and documents. Travelers could expect certain protections if they complied with established procedures. For Marco, this was an important shift. In Europe, political authority was fragmented, borders were uncertain, allegiance changed frequently. Here, authority extended across vast distances with surprising coherence. This did not mean that travel was easy, it meant that it was predictable. Marco began to appreciate the value of predictability as a form of security. Caravan life introduced its own routines. Days were structured around movement, rest, and maintenance. Animals required care, equipment had to be checked, food supplies were managed carefully. Delays were common and accepted. Marco learned patience not as a moral virtue, but as a practical necessity. Impatience led to mistakes. Mistakes were costly. Illness was an ever-present concern. Changes in climate, diet, and exertion took their toll. Marco experienced periods of weakness that slowed progress. These interruptions were not dramatic. They were absorbed into the journey. Rest replaced movement. Recovery replaced ambition. The road accommodated these pauses without judgment. Encounters with other travelers expanded Marco's understanding of the world beyond Venice. Merchants from Central Asia, Persia, and the Middle East shared information about routes, markets, and conditions ahead. These exchanges were factual. They focused on what was useful. Marco learned to value such information and to assess its reliability based on the speaker's experience. The idea of distance changed during these months. In Venice, distance was measured in days or weeks. Here, it was measured in seasons. Plans extended over years rather than months. Marco began to understand that returning home was not a matter of deciding to do so. It required alignment of opportunity, health, and political conditions. As they moved deeper into Asia, the social fabric around them shifted. Clothing styles changed, diets adapted to available resources, religious practices varied widely. Marco observed these differences without seeking to categorize them rigidly. He noted how communities organized daily life, resolved disputes, and interacted with authority. One of the most significant realizations during this phase was that the journey itself was a form of integration. They were not moving through empty space. They were passing through interconnected regions linked by trade, administration, and shared expectations. The road was not marginal, it was central. Marco's role gradually expanded. He assisted with record keeping, he helped manage supplies, he served as a messenger within the caravan. These responsibilities were not assigned formally. They emerged naturally as his competence became evident. He learned that usefulness was recognized quietly. The journey also exposed Marco to the limits of preparation. No amount of planning could account for every obstacle. Weather shifted unexpectedly. Political tensions flared and subsided. Routes closed and reopened. Marco learned to accept uncertainty as a constant rather than an exception. At times, the scale of the journey became apparent in subtle ways. Accents changed beyond easy recognition. Coins, unfamiliar in shape and inscription, circulated. Measures and weights differed. Marco learned to convert mentally, to adapt without complaint. These adjustments became second nature. Despite the challenges, the journey was not marked by constant hardship. There were stretches of relative comfort. Inns provided rest. Markets offered variety. Festivals and local gatherings introduced moments of communal life. Marco observed these without participating deeply, aware that he remained a visitor. The presence of Mongol administration continued to shape the experience. Official stations provided fresh animals and supplies. Documents were inspected and honored. This infrastructure impressed Marco not because it was luxurious, but because it functioned reliably across distance. As months passed, Marco's sense of self shifted. He no longer thought of himself primarily as a Venetian abroad. He began to see himself as a traveler within a broader system. This perspective reduced anxiety. He was not lost. He was located within a network. The physical demands of the journey strengthened Marco's endurance. He adapted to long days of movement, irregular meals, and varied climates. Fatigue became manageable. Discomfort became expected. These adaptations occurred gradually, without conscious effort. The emotional dimension of the journey was muted. Marco did not dwell on separation from home. Communication with Venice was impossible. Memory substituted for correspondence. This distance encouraged presence. Attention focused on immediate conditions rather than distant concerns. As they approached regions closer to the Mongol court, the scale of governance became more visible. Larger settlements appeared. Administrative buildings marked centers of authority. Officials traveled with purpose. Marco observed how order was maintained through routine rather than spectacle. The anticipation of arrival did not dominate Marco's thoughts. The journey itself demanded attention. Each stage required adjustment. Expectations were deferred. This restraint would later shape his descriptions, which emphasized process over climax. By the time they neared the territories directly associated with the Great Khan, Marco had already traveled farther than most Europeans of his era would in a lifetime. Yet he did not perceive this as exceptional. The journey had normalized distance. The first journey east was not a single event but a sequence of adaptations. It reshaped Marco's understanding of time, authority, and belonging. He learned that the world could be navigated through attentiveness rather than assertion. This phase laid the groundwork for what followed. It taught Marco how to move within unfamiliar systems without resistance. It prepared him to observe rather than react. These qualities would become increasingly important as he entered the center of Mongol power. As the road carried them onward, Marco remained steady. He did not rush ahead mentally. He allowed the journey to define its own pace. This acceptance would later lend credibility to his accounts, which avoided exaggeration and focused on what he had seen and understood. The first journey east thus functioned as both passage and education. It did not promise resolution, it established continuity. The road did not end here, it widened. Roads, deserts, and delay. As the journey continued beyond the more settled regions, the roads ceased to resemble anything familiar from Europe. It no longer passed predictably from town to town or followed waterways that guided movement. Instead, it stretched across spaces defined by scarcity. Distances lengthened, landmarks thinned. The idea of progress shifted from miles covered to survival maintained. For Marco Polo, this phase of travel altered his understanding of movement more deeply than any before it. The routes leading eastward were not singular paths. They were braided networks of tracks that shifted with seasons, political conditions, and available water. Caravans selected routes based on recent information rather than fixed maps. Marco learned that knowledge of the road was temporary. What was safe one year might be unusable the next. Travelers depended on local guides whose authority came from experience rather than status. Desert regions introduced a different rhythm. Days were structured around heat and light. Movement began early, paused when the sun reached its height, and resumed only when conditions allowed. Marco observed how people accustomed to these environments conserved energy. Nothing was rushed. Even speech was economical. He learned that endurance here depended less on strength than on restraint. Water defined everything. Wells became centers of activity and risk. Their locations were guarded knowledge, passed between those who relied upon them. Marco saw how entire routes were planned around these points, and how miscalculation could lead to catastrophe. The presence or absence of water determined not only comfort but survival. The deserts also challenged assumptions about emptiness. Though sparsely populated, they were not voids. Nomadic groups moved with seasonal patterns, their lives organized around animals, weather, and memory. Marco noted how these communities navigated space without permanent structures, relying on knowledge accumulated over generations. Their familiarity with the land contrasted sharply with the vulnerability of travelers passing through. Delays became common. Sandstorms halted movement. Illness spread through caravans. Animals faltered. Marco learned that delay was not failure, it was a condition to be managed. Resources were adjusted. Expectations recalibrated. The journey absorbed these pauses without losing direction. During these intervals, Marco observed human behavior under constraint. Disagreements arose but were handled pragmatically. Cooperation was enforced by necessity. Individuals who disrupted collective survival were isolated or removed. The desert did not tolerate disorder. This environment taught Marco that social rules often emerge from practical needs rather than formal authority. The monotony of the landscape sharpened attention to detail. Changes in ground texture, wind direction, or animal behavior signaled shifts in conditions. Marco learned to read these signs from those more experienced than himself. Observation became active rather than passive. It required interpretation. At night, the desert offered clarity. The absence of artificial light revealed the sky with precision. Marco did not dwell on this aesthetically. He noted it functionally. Navigation depended on celestial markers. Time was measured through stars and temperature rather than bells or schedules. This reinforced the idea that systems adapted to environment. As the journey progressed, the accumulation of delay altered Marco's sense of time. Weeks lost their significance. Seasons became the primary measure. This temporal shift reduced anxiety. When progress could not be forced, patience became a form of control. Mountain regions introduced new challenges. Elevation affected breathing and movement. Paths narrowed. Weather shifted rapidly. Marco observed how caravans adjusted composition in response. Loads were redistributed. Pace slowed further. Animals unsuited to terrain were replaced. These adjustments required negotiation and trust. Political conditions also influenced delay. Borders were not marked clearly. Authority overlapped. Permissions had to be secured. Marco saw how documentation mattered in these regions. Seals and letters were not symbolic. They were practical tools that determined access and safety. In some areas, the Mongol administrative presence was less visible, but its influence remained. Local officials understood broader expectations. Travelers who complied with established procedures were generally protected. Marco learned that compliance did not imply submission. It was a transaction. Illness continued to interrupt progress. Marco experienced extended periods of weakness that required rest. These were not framed as crises. They were absorbed into the rhythm of travel. Recovery was prioritized over schedule. The journey adapted to the traveler rather than the reverse. Food scarcity altered diet. Meals became repetitive and functional. Marco learned to accept unfamiliar foods without comment. Nutritional necessity replaced preference. This adaptation reduced resistance and preserved energy. Communication across linguistic boundaries became more challenging. Interpreters were essential. Misunderstandings occurred but were usually resolved through repetition and gesture. Marco noted how patience facilitated understanding more effectively than insistence. The accumulation of hardship did not produce dramatic turning points. It produced steadiness. Marco's expectations narrowed to immediate needs. This focus reduced emotional strain. He learned that anticipation could be more exhausting than experience. Despite the difficulty, the road maintained continuity. Information flowed. Caravans encountered one another, exchanged news, and diverged. This network sustained movement across vast distances. Marco recognized that isolation was relative. Even in remote regions, connection existed. The delays also deepened Marco's understanding of the scale of the Mongol world. The empire's reach was evident not only in its centers but in its margins. Even where direct administration was light, the influence of broader order shaped behavior. Trade routes were respected, violence was limited, predictability persisted. As months passed, Marco's physical endurance stabilized, his body adapted, his mind adjusted. He no longer measured progress against original plans, he measured it against present conditions. This adaptability became habitual. The deserts and mountains did not inspire fear or wonder in Marco. They inspired respect. He learned that environments imposed conditions that demanded response rather than judgment. This approach would later characterize his descriptions of cities and courts. The cumulative effect of delay was transformative. It stripped away expectations formed in Venice and replaced them with practical understanding. Marco learned that systems functioned differently under constraint, and that success depended on alignment with those systems. As the journey resumed toward more settled regions, Marco carried with him lessons shaped by scarcity and patience. He understood that movement through the world required more than intention. It required accommodation. These stretches of road, desert, and delay did not advance the narrative in dramatic ways. They prepared the traveler. They refined attention. They reinforced humility. Marco emerged from them less concerned with destination and more attuned to process. When signs of more organized administration reappeared, better roads, official stations, predictable supplies, Marco recognized their value. He had experienced their absence. This contrast deepened his appreciation without idealization. The journey did not accelerate immediately. Delays continued. Yet each pause confirmed that progress was cumulative. The road, though slow, was continuous. By the end of this phase, Marco had internalized a crucial lesson. Endurance was not passive, it was active adaptation. This understanding would shape how he engaged with the political and cultural centers ahead. The deserts and mountains receded behind them gradually. They did not mark an ending. They marked a threshold crossed through patience. The journey moved forward, altered by what it had demanded. Arrival in the Mongol world. The transition from the outer regions of the journey into the heart of Mongol-controlled territory did not announce itself with a single moment of arrival. There was no clear boundary where uncertainty ended and order began. Instead, the change revealed itself gradually, through consistency. Roads became more reliably maintained. Official stations appeared at regular intervals. Information traveled with greater speed and accuracy. For Marco Polo, this shift was perceptible not as relief, but as recognition. He understood that he had entered a system. The Mongol world he encountered was not defined solely by conquest, as it was often described in distant lands. It was defined by administration. Authority was exercised through expectation rather than spectacle. Rules were not explained repeatedly. They were assumed to be known and followed. Travelers who complied moved with relative freedom. Those who did not were corrected swiftly. Marco noticed early that movement within this world depended on documentation. Seals, letters, and official permissions carried tangible power. They were inspected carefully and honored consistently. This predictability reduced friction. It allowed merchants, messengers, and officials to operate across vast distances without constant negotiation. For Marco, accustomed to fragmented European authority, this coherence was striking. The landscape itself reflected this organization. Roads followed deliberate routes, bridges were maintained, way stations provided food, shelter, and fresh animals. These facilities were not luxurious, but they were reliable. Their presence signaled state interest in mobility. Movement was not incidental, it was encouraged. As Marco and his companions advanced, they encountered officials whose authority derived from appointment rather than lineage. These men were accountable to higher levels of administration. Records were kept. Reports were expected. Marco observed how responsibility flowed upward through structured channels. This reduced reliance on personal allegiance and increased emphasis on performance. The population within Mongol territories was diverse. Marco encountered people of different languages, religions, and customs living under a single political framework. This diversity was not homogenized. It was managed. Local practices continued, provided they did not interfere with taxation, order, or communication. Marco recognized that uniformity was not the goal, stability was. Markets within this world functioned with efficiency. Goods moved along established routes. Prices fluctuated, but followed recognizable patterns. Marco noted how trade benefited from reduced risk. Merchants traveled with confidence that agreements would be enforced and disputes resolved. This encouraged exchange on a scale unfamiliar to most Europeans. The Mongol approach to governance emphasized information. Messengers traveled quickly between administrative centers. News moved faster than people. Marco learned that awareness of conditions across the empire allowed centralized decision-making without constant physical presence. This reliance on communication rather than force impressed him. As they progressed deeper, Marco became increasingly aware that his status as a foreigner was less significant than his usefulness. The Mongol system valued capability. Those who could contribute were integrated. Those who could not were peripheral. This pragmatic approach reduced emphasis on origin. Marco's youth and attentiveness worked in his favor. He listened, he observed, he learned protocols without being instructed repeatedly. He noticed how officials interacted with one another, how deference was expressed, and how authority was acknowledged. These observations allowed him to move without drawing unnecessary attention. The scale of the Mongol world became evident in subtle ways. Time was measured differently. Decisions considered regional impact rather than local consequence. Marco learned to think beyond immediate surroundings. He began to understand that actions here could affect conditions far away. The presence of the Great Khan loomed even when he was not physically present. His authority was felt through consistent policy and expectation. Marco recognized that this centralized figure functioned as a reference point rather than a constant actor. Power radiated outward through delegation. Cultural practices within this world varied widely. Marco observed religious tolerance that contrasted with European conflicts of his era. Buddhist temples, Islamic mosques, Christian communities, and traditional practices coexisted. The state did not enforce belief, it enforced order. Marco noted that this reduced tension and allowed focus on governance. The journey brought Marco into contact with urban centers that challenged his assumptions about scale. Cities extended beyond what he had known. Infrastructure supported large populations, streets were organized, public works were maintained. Marco did not interpret this as superiority. He interpreted it as adaptation to density. Administrative efficiency was visible in taxation. Systems existed to assess production and collect revenue without excessive force. Marco observed how predictable taxation reduced resistance. People understood obligations and planned accordingly. As Marco adjusted to this environment, his sense of personal identity shifted further. He no longer felt defined by origin. He felt defined by role. This allowed him to function without constant self-reference. He focused on understanding expectations and meeting them. The Mongol world also demanded adaptability. Officials were reassigned frequently. Policies shifted in response to conditions. Marco observed how flexibility was valued over tradition. Precedent mattered less than outcome. This contrasted with European reliance on inherited privilege. Language barriers persisted, but translation was institutionalized. Interpreters were common. Multilingualism was practical rather than exceptional. Marco learned to communicate through intermediaries without frustration. He accepted delay and understanding as part of process. As they approached the regions closer to the court, ceremonial elements increased slightly. Protocol became more visible. Dress signaled status. Procedures marked access. Marco paid attention to these cues, recognizing their importance in maintaining order. Despite the complexity, the environment did not feel oppressive. Rules were clear. Consequences were known. This transparency reduced anxiety. Marco understood where he stood at any given moment. The transition into the Mongol world did not erase hardship. Travel remained demanding. Climate and distance continued to challenge, yet the presence of structure mitigated unpredictability. Marco learned that systems could reduce, though not eliminate, difficulty. This phase of the journey marked a turning point in Marco's understanding of governance. He saw how authority could function across diversity without constant enforcement. He recognized the value of administration grounded in information. As Marco moved toward direct contact with the center of power, he carried with him a growing respect for the system he had entered. This respect was not uncritical admiration. It was acknowledgement of effectiveness. The arrival in the Mongol world did not conclude the journey. It reframed it. Marco was no longer simply passing through. He was entering a sphere where his actions would be observed, evaluated, and potentially utilized. The road ahead led toward the court of the Great Khan. The environment Marco now navigated would shape his responsibilities and experiences in ways he could not yet anticipate. Yet the qualities he had developed, attention, patience, adaptability, aligned well with the expectations of this world. The Mongol world did not overwhelm Marco. It oriented him. It provided context. It offered a framework within which his journey could continue with purpose. Meeting the Great Khan. The approach to the court of the Great Khan unfolded without drama. There was no sudden revelation, no sharp moment when Marco Polo understood that he had arrived at the center of one of the world's largest empires. Instead, the significance of the moment emerged gradually through layers of procedure, distance, and expectation. The closer they moved toward the Khan's presence, the more regulated their movement became. Permissions were checked with greater care. Schedules tightened. Information flowed upward through channels Marco could sense but not yet see fully. For Marco, this was not a moment charged with anticipation in the way later generations would imagine. He had learned by now that power announced itself through routine rather than spectacle. The Great Khan was not encountered suddenly. He was approached through systems designed to manage access and attention. This structure impressed Marco more than any display might have done. The court itself was not fixed permanently in one place. The Khan moved between seasonal capitals, following patterns that balanced governance, climate, and tradition. Marco encountered a political center that was mobile yet stable, capable of relocating without losing coherence. This challenged European assumptions about rule, which were tied closely to fixed seats of power. Here, authority traveled. When Marco was first presented at court, he did not perceive himself as an individual of consequence. He was part of a small group, accompanying his father and uncle, whose prior experience had already established credibility. The reception followed established protocol. There was no intimacy, no immediate favor. Observation preceded engagement. Kublai Khan himself did not embody the restless energy associated with conquest. By the time Marco encountered him, Kublai Khan ruled as an administrator more than a warrior. His authority rested on consolidation rather than expansion. Marco observed a ruler attentive to information, detail, and management. Decisions were made deliberately, often after consultation. The atmosphere of the court was not loud or chaotic. It was controlled. Officials moved with purpose. Messengers arrived and departed. Reports were received, assessed, and archived. Marco noted that silence often signaled concentration rather than tension. The environment valued clarity. Marco's youth set him apart. He was not treated with suspicion, nor was he indulged. He was assessed. His ability to observe and remember was noted. His willingness to learn procedures and follow expectations distinguished him. He did not attempt to assert himself. He allowed attention to find him. Language at court was layered. Multiple tongues were spoken, each serving specific functions. Interpreters facilitated communication, but Marco noticed that many officials understood more than one language. This multilingual competence reduced misunderstanding and accelerated administration. Marco adapted quickly, learning when to speak and when to listen. The Great Khan's interest in foreigners was pragmatic. He valued information from beyond his immediate realm. Marco's experiences along the road, his observations of distant regions, and his capacity to recount them accurately made him useful. This usefulness was not rewarded immediately. It was tested. Marco did not receive grand assignments at once. He was observed over time. Small tasks were assigned. Reports were evaluated for accuracy. His reliability became evident gradually. This incremental trust suited Marco's temperament. He did not seek rapid advancement. The court itself reflected the empire's diversity. Officials from different regions and backgrounds worked alongside one another. Ethnicity and religion were secondary to function. Marco observed that loyalty was directed toward the system rather than lineage. This reinforced stability. Ritual existed, but it served governance rather than mystique. Ceremonies marked seasons, transitions, and obligations. Marco observed them as components of order rather than expressions of ideology. They structured time and reinforced authority without excess. The Khan's presence was calm. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, it was with precision. Marco noticed that questions were framed to elicit information rather than affirmation. This encouraged honesty. It discouraged exaggeration. Marco's memory became his most valuable asset. He learned to retain details of geography, custom, and administration. He understood that what he reported could influence decisions affecting distant regions. This responsibility sharpened his attention. He learned to separate observation from interpretation. The court's administrative reach extended far beyond its physical location. Marco encountered maps, records, and inventories that documented regions he had not seen. He realized that governance depended on representation as much as presence, information substituted for direct control. Over time, Marco's role expanded. He was sent on missions that required observation and reporting rather than negotiation or command. These journeys deepened his understanding of the empire's internal dynamics. He learned how policies were implemented locally and adjusted as needed. The Great Khan's trust was not personal in the way European patronage often was. It was institutional. Marco was trusted because he performed reliably within the system. This distinction mattered. It meant that favor was contingent on continued competence. Marco observed how the court managed succession concerns, regional unrest, and economic fluctuation. Decisions were informed by data gathered across the empire. This reliance on information contrasted with European reliance on tradition and precedent alone. The court did not isolate itself from the empire. It remained connected through constant communication. Marco noted that even distant events were discussed promptly. This reduced uncertainty and allowed proactive governance. Living within this environment altered Marco's perception of scale. He learned to think in terms of regions rather than cities, populations rather than households. This shift expanded his conceptual framework. Despite the formality, life at court was not austere. Resources were abundant, provisioning was efficient. Marco noted how logistical planning supported large numbers of people without visible strain. This efficiency impressed him more than luxury. The Khan's approach to religion continued to shape court culture. Diversity was accepted. Religious leaders were consulted but did not dominate governance. Marco observed that belief was treated as personal rather than political, reducing conflict. Marco's position remained that of an observer rather than a decision-maker. This allowed him to see without being responsible for outcomes. His accounts later would reflect this perspective, focusing on description rather than justification. The meeting with the Great Khan did not culminate in a single defining moment. It unfolded over years, trust accumulated, responsibility increased. Marco's understanding deepened. This period marked a shift from travel to residence. Marco's life became structured around service rather than movement. Yet movement remained central. He was dispatched across the empire, extending the Khan's awareness. The Great Khan did not mold Marco into a courtier in the European sense. He utilized him as a resource. This functional relationship suited both parties. Marco remained attentive and adaptable. As years passed, Marco became integrated into the rhythm of the court. He learned its expectations implicitly. He understood how to navigate its hierarchy without ambition or resistance. This meeting, gradual and unremarkable on the surface, proved decisive. It placed Marco within a system that would define much of his adult life. It provided him with access, perspective, and responsibility. The Great Khan did not elevate Marco through ceremony. He did so through use. Marco's reliability earned him continued inclusion. This quiet advancement reflected the values of the system. By the end of this phase, Marco was no longer simply a traveler. He was a participant in imperial administration. His identity continued to shift, shaped by responsibility rather than origin. The encounter with the Great Khan thus functioned not as climax but as foundation. It established conditions under which Marco's experiences would accumulate meaning. Life at the Yuan court. Life at the court of the Great Khan settled into a rhythm that was neither hurried nor idle. It moved according to calendars, reports, and the steady arrival and departure of information. For Marco Polo, residence within this environment required a different kind of attention than travel had demanded. The road had trained him to adapt to changing conditions. The court required him to maintain consistency within a complex and carefully managed system. The court itself was expansive, not only in physical scale but in function. It served as an administrative center, a ceremonial space, a logistical hub, and a point of coordination for regions separated by thousands of miles. Marco observed that these functions did not compete with one another. They were integrated. Decisions made in one area accounted for consequences in others. Daily life followed patterns that were understood without constant instruction. Officials arrived at designated times, reports were submitted according to schedule, audiences were granted through established procedures. Marco learned that predictability was valued because it reduced uncertainty. The court functioned not through improvisation, but through repetition refined over time. Marco's role within this environment continued to evolve. He was not confined to observation alone. He participated in administrative routines, assisted with record-keeping, and was dispatched on assignments that required careful reporting. These tasks did not elevate him socially in visible ways, but they increased his responsibility. The diversity of the court remained one of its most striking features. Individuals from many regions served side by side. Their backgrounds differed, but their duties aligned. Marco noticed that shared purpose outweighed origin. This reduced friction and encouraged cooperation. Disputes were resolved through procedure rather than personal confrontation. Language remained a constant consideration. Communication depended on interpreters and multilingual officials. Marco became accustomed to delayed understanding. He learned to wait for clarity rather than assume it. This patience prevented errors. It also reinforced humility. No single language dominated all functions. The court's architecture reflected its administrative priorities. Buildings were designed to accommodate large gatherings, storage, and communication. Spaces were functional rather than ornamental. Marco observed how layout facilitated movement and oversight. Nothing appeared accidental. Ceremonial life existed, but it was regulated. Rituals marked seasonal transitions, diplomatic events, and administrative milestones. These ceremonies reinforced authority without overwhelming daily operations. Marco learned that ritual here served governance rather than spectacle. The Great Khan's presence continued to influence the court even when he was not physically present. His policies shaped decisions, his expectations guided conduct. Marco noticed that authority was internalized. Officials acted with reference to established norms rather than constant instruction. Information flowed continuously. Messengers arrived with reports from distant provinces. These reports were assessed, compared, and archived. Marco observed how discrepancies were investigated rather than ignored. Accuracy mattered. Errors were corrected quietly. Marco's assignments often involved travel within the empire. These journeys differed from his earlier travels. They were purposeful and structured. He traveled with authority granted by the court. This altered interactions with local officials. Access was smoother. Expectations were clear. Through these assignments, Marco gained insight into how policies were implemented beyond the court. He observed regional variation within a unified framework. Local conditions influenced application, but core principles remained consistent. This balance maintained stability across diversity. The court's economic administration impressed Marco. Taxation was systematic, resources were allocated deliberately, surpluses were stored for contingencies. Marco saw how planning mitigated risk. The state anticipated scarcity rather than reacting to it. The use of paper currency was particularly notable. Marco observed how trust in the system sustained its value. Currency functioned because it was accepted universally within the empire. This acceptance was enforced through regulation rather than force. Marco recognized the importance of institutional trust. Postal and courier systems facilitated governance. Messages traveled rapidly between regions. Marco noted that speed of communication reduced reliance on local autonomy. Central authority remained informed and responsive. This network required maintenance and oversight, which the court provided. Religious life at court remained diverse. Marco observed leaders of different faiths engaging with the state without dominating it. Religious disputes were managed to prevent disruption. The state's neutrality reduced conflict. This approach contrasted sharply with European religious tensions of the era. Marco's personal life within the court was restrained. He did not establish a household or seek personal enrichment. His focus remained on service. This restraint preserved his position. He avoided entanglements that might compromise neutrality. The passage of time within the court felt different from travel. Days were structured, weeks followed predictable cycles. Years passed marked by administrative continuity rather than movement. Marco adapted to this stability without restlessness. He learned to measure success not through advancement, but through sustained trust. Continued assignment signaled confidence. Removal signaled failure. This clarity reduced anxiety. Expectations were transparent. The court also managed succession concerns carefully. Marco observed how potential instability was anticipated. Advisors discussed contingencies. Plans were prepared. This foresight aimed to preserve continuity. The state valued durability over individual ambition. Cultural exchange occurred naturally within the court. Foods, clothing styles, and customs circulated, Marco observed, without attempting to adopt or reject these elements. He understood that participation was functional rather than expressive. The court's relationship with merchants remained pragmatic. Trade was encouraged. Regulation ensured stability. Marco noted how economic vitality supported administrative capacity. Prosperity reinforced order. Education within the court emphasized practical knowledge. Training focused on administration, accounting, and communication. Marco observed that expertise was cultivated deliberately. Skill development served state needs. As Marco's familiarity deepened, he gained access to broader information. He learned about regions he had not visited. He understood how decisions affected distant populations. This awareness expanded his perspective. Despite the scale and complexity, the court did not feel oppressive. Its order created predictability. Marco understood how to navigate it. This reduced personal strain. The court's discipline extended to conduct. Officials were expected to maintain composure. Emotional display was limited. Marco adapted to this norm. He learned to convey information calmly. Over time, Marco's presence became routine. He was no longer an anomaly. He was part of the system. This integration occurred without ceremony. It was the result of consistency. The Yuan court's stability relied on balance. Authority was centralized but delegated. Diversity was permitted but managed. Marco observed this equilibrium and recognized its fragility. Maintenance required constant attention. Marco's experiences at court would later inform his descriptions. He would emphasize structure over spectacle. His accounts would reflect the routines that sustained power rather than moments of drama. Life at the court was not static. Policies evolved, personnel changed, yet the system persisted. Marco learned that governance was a process, not a state. As years accumulated, Marco's sense of belonging shifted again. He belonged to the work rather than the place. His identity aligned with function. This phase of his life reinforced lessons learned earlier. Systems mattered, information mattered, patience mattered. These principles guided his actions. The court did not offer closure, it offered continuity. Marco's role remained open-ended. Assignments continued, responsibilities evolved. Life at the Yuan court thus shaped Marco profoundly. It refined his observational skills. It expanded his understanding of governance. It anchored his experience within a functioning empire. By the end of this phase, Marco had internalized the court's rhythms. He moved within them with ease. The world he inhabited was vast, ordered, and attentive. Service and observation. Service within the Mongol administration did not announce itself through rank or title in the way Marco Polo might once have expected. It revealed itself through use. Over time, his assignments grew more varied and more demanding, not because he sought advancement, but because his reliability made him suitable for tasks that required discretion and clarity. The empire valued information gathered accurately and conveyed without distortion, and Marco's temperament aligned with that need. The nature of his service emphasized movement rather than permanence. While the court remained the center of coordination, its reach extended outward through envoys and inspectors whose purpose was to observe conditions and report them faithfully. Marco became one of these instruments of awareness. He traveled along established routes, carrying authority that opened doors but also imposed responsibility. Local officials expected precision. They anticipated questions. They recognized that reports would travel upward. Each assignment followed a similar structure without feeling repetitive. Marco received instructions that outlined objectives rather than methods. He was trusted to determine how to observe, what to note, and how to present his findings. This autonomy required judgment. He learned to distinguish between information that was incidental and information that was consequential. The difference often lay in pattern rather than event. The regions he visited varied widely. Some were densely populated, with established administrative centers and regular markets. Others were sparsely settled, their governance lighter, but still integrated into the imperial framework. Marco observed how policies adapted to local conditions. Taxation differed in form but not in principle. Authority was visible or subtle depending on necessity. Travel under imperial auspices differed markedly from his earlier journeys. Logistics were supported, lodging was arranged, supplies were predictable. Yet this support came with expectations. Delays required explanation. Deviations were noted. Marco learned that freedom of movement existed within boundaries defined by accountability. Observation extended beyond infrastructure and administration. Marco paid attention to how people lived within these systems. He noted daily routines, methods of production, and social organization. He observed how communities balanced tradition with imperial requirements. These details provided context for policy effectiveness. Marco's reports avoided judgment. He did not evaluate cultures against one another. He described functions. He noted outcomes. This approach aligned with the empire's pragmatic orientation. Decisions required understanding rather than comparison. One of the recurring themes in his observations was scale. The empire's vastness demanded coordination at levels unfamiliar to European governance. Marco learned to think in terms of flows of goods, people, and information. He saw how disruptions in one area affected others. This systemic perspective sharpened his analytical capacity. Economic activity remained a central focus. Marco observed production processes, from agriculture to crafts. He noted how surpluses were stored and distributed. He saw how shortages were anticipated and mitigated. The state's involvement varied, but its interest remained constant. Technological practices also drew Marco's attention. He encountered methods of construction, transportation, and communication that differed from those of Europe. He described them without embellishment. Their significance lay in utility rather than novelty. Marco's role required him to interact with officials of varying rank. He learned to navigate hierarchy without asserting superiority. Respect was shown through adherence to protocol. This reduced friction and facilitated cooperation. Language continued to shape his experience. Reports were translated. Nuance required careful expression. Marco learned to structure information clearly to survive translation without distortion. This skill influenced the clarity of his later accounts. The passage of time during these years was marked by assignment rather than calendar. Marco measured life through journeys completed and reports submitted. This rhythm reinforced focus. Personal milestones faded in importance. Despite the outward movement, Marco remained connected to the court through communication. His reports were received and acknowledged. Feedback, when given, was concise. Corrections were specific. This reinforced standards. Observation also extended to the limits of administration. Marco noted regions where enforcement was light and local autonomy greater. He observed how the empire tolerated variation when direct control was inefficient. This flexibility preserved stability. Marco's service exposed him to environmental diversity. He traveled through plains, river valleys, forests, and coastal regions. Each demanded different administrative approaches. Marco learned that governance responded to geography. The human dimension of service was understated. Marco did not form close personal ties during these assignments. Relationships remained professional. This distance preserved objectivity. It also limited personal entanglement. Illness and fatigue occasionally interrupted his work. These interruptions were accommodated without stigma. The system valued long-term reliability over short-term output. Marco appreciated this pragmatism. Security concerns existed, but were managed systematically. Escorts were assigned when necessary. Routes were adjusted based on intelligence. Marco observed how risk was mitigated through planning rather than reaction. The accumulation of observation refined Marco's understanding of the empire's cohesion. It was not maintained through fear alone. It relied on predictability, mutual benefit, and information flow. Marco saw how compliance was encouraged through stability. As his experience broadened, Marco became aware of how exceptional his position was. Few Europeans had access to such breadth, yet this awareness did not lead to self-importance. It reinforced responsibility. Marco's reporting style evolved. He learned to prioritize clarity over completeness. He selected details that illustrated patterns. This selectivity increased the usefulness of his reports. The service also taught Marco about limits. Not all information could be acted upon. Constraints existed. Marco learned to accept that reporting did not guarantee change. This tempered expectations. Throughout these years, Marco's identity continued to shift. He was no longer defined by origin or novelty. He was defined by function. This reduced the psychological weight of displacement. The empire's reliance on observation validated Marco's approach. His attentiveness found purpose. His patience found application. His neutrality found value. As assignments accumulated, Marco's familiarity with the empire deepened. He understood its strengths and vulnerabilities. He saw how stability depended on constant adjustment. Service and observation thus formed the core of Marco's life during this period. They provided structure without confinement. They offered responsibility without spectacle. These experiences would later inform his recollections. He would describe systems because he had served within them. He would note patterns because he had observed across regions. The work did not culminate in a defining achievement. It continued. Its significance lay in accumulation. As Marco returned periodically to the court, his reports contributed incrementally to imperial awareness. He was one instrument among many. This context mattered. The years passed without dramatic markers. Marco aged within service. His perspective matured. By the end of this phase, Marco had traveled extensively within a single political framework. He understood how diversity could be governed through consistency. This understanding would shape his legacy. Service had become routine. Observation had become habit. The journey continued, not toward a destination, but through experience. Cities of Asia. As Marco Polo's service carried him across the breadth of the empire, cities emerged as anchors within the vastness. They were not interruptions in travel so much as nodes in a continuous system. Each city functioned as a point where administration, commerce, and daily life converged. For Marco, who had grown up in Venice, cities were familiar in principle. Yet the cities he encountered across Asia expanded his understanding of what urban life could be when shaped by different conditions and priorities. These cities were not uniform. Their forms reflected geography, history, and function. Some grew along rivers that carried goods and people with steady reliability. Others rose near crossroads where caravan routes converged. Coastal cities oriented themselves toward maritime trade, while inland centers focused on overland exchange. Marco learned to read a city's purpose through its layout and activity. One of the most striking aspects was scale. Populations were larger than Marco had known. Streets extended farther. Markets covered greater areas. The movement of people followed rhythms that suggested long-established coordination. Marco did not interpret this scale as excess. He understood it as the result of sustained stability and resource management. Urban administration was visible without being intrusive. Officials operated from designated offices. Records were kept systematically. Tax collection occurred regularly and predictably. Marco noted that predictability reduced tension. People planned their lives around known obligations. Disputes were addressed through established procedures rather than personal negotiation. Markets formed the heart of many cities. They were organized by trade rather than by chance. Goods were grouped by type. Weights and measures were standardized. Marco observed how this standardization facilitated trust. Buyers and sellers shared expectations. Transactions proceeded efficiently. The diversity of goods impressed Marco not because of novelty, but because of logistics. Products arrived from distant regions in consistent quantities. This implied coordination across vast distances. Marco recognized the administrative effort required to sustain such flow. Trade was not spontaneous, it was supported. Infrastructure extended beyond markets. Roads within cities were maintained. Water systems supplied households and workshops. Storage facilities protected goods from spoilage. Marco observed how these systems supported large populations without constant crisis. Maintenance was continuous rather than reactive. Housing reflected social organization. Dwellings varied in size and construction, but followed recognizable patterns. Neighborhoods often specialized in certain trades. This clustering increased efficiency. Marco noted how proximity facilitated collaboration and oversight. Public spaces served functional purposes. They hosted markets, announcements, and administrative activities. Marco observed that these spaces reinforced community identity without requiring ceremonial emphasis. They were used rather than celebrated. Transportation within cities adapted to scale. Carts, animals, and human labor moved goods efficiently. Regulations governed movement to prevent congestion. Marco recognized parallels to Venice's canal management, though executed differently. The role of women in urban life varied by region. Marco observed participation in trade, crafts, and household management. He noted these roles without judgment, recognizing that economic necessity shaped social norms. Food supply systems sustained urban populations. Marco observed how cities depended on surrounding regions for grain and produce. Storage and distribution mitigated seasonal variation. Famine, when it occurred, was addressed through redistribution rather than abandonment. Craft production flourished. Marco observed workshops producing textiles, metal goods, ceramics, and paper. Specialization improved quality and output. The state regulated some industries to ensure supply and standards. Marco noted how regulation balanced innovation and consistency. Education and knowledge transmission occurred through practical means. Apprenticeship trained skills. Administrative roles required literacy and numeracy. Marco observed that education served function rather than prestige. Religious structures existed within cities, but they did not dominate civic life. Marco observed temples, mosques, and churches integrated into neighborhoods. Religious practice coexisted with commerce and administration without constant conflict. Law enforcement was present but measured. Officials maintained order through visibility rather than force. Marco noted that predictability reduced the need for intervention. When enforcement occurred, it followed procedure. Communication within cities was efficient. Announcements were made publicly. Notices circulated through officials and markets. Marco recognized that information flow supported order. The relationship between city and countryside was symbiotic. Cities depended on rural production. Rural regions relied on urban markets. Marco observed how this interdependence shaped policy. Stability required balance. Some cities served as administrative capitals. Others specialized in trade or production. Marco learned to distinguish their roles through activity patterns. Capitals emphasized record-keeping and governance. Trade cities emphasized exchange and logistics. Marco also noted urban responses to environmental constraints. In flood-prone areas, construction adapted. In arid regions, water management was prioritized. Cities were not imposed on environments. They adapted to them. Security within cities relied on layered systems. Gates controlled access. Patrols monitored activity. Yet Marco observed that trust remained central. Social norms reinforced order. The presence of foreigners in cities varied. Trade hubs attracted diverse populations. Administrative centers were more controlled. Marco noted how policies balanced openness and oversight. Urban life shaped social behavior. Schedules aligned with market hours and administrative routines. Marco observed how time was structured around collective activity. The aesthetic dimension of cities was understated in Marco's observations. He noted construction quality and organization rather than ornamentation. Beauty, when present, served function. The accumulation of urban experiences refined Marco's comparative understanding. He did not rank cities hierarchically. He understood them contextually. Each solved problems according to circumstance. These cities challenged European assumptions about civilization. Marco did not frame this challenge explicitly. He described systems and outcomes. Readers would later draw conclusions. Marco's movement through cities reinforced his appreciation for infrastructure. Roads, markets, and administration sustained urban life. Without them, scale would collapse. The cities also demonstrated the empire's capacity to integrate diversity. Different customs persisted within a unified framework. Marco recognized this as a strength. As Marco traveled onward, cities receded and reappeared. Each added to his understanding. None stood alone. By the end of this phase, Marco had seen urban life across a spectrum of environments. He understood that cities were expressions of governance, economy, and geography. These observations would later form a substantial part of his accounts. He would describe cities not as marvels, but as systems. The journey continued, carrying Marco onward through spaces where cities anchored order amid distance, wealth, trade, and technology. Wealth within the Mongol world did not present itself primarily through accumulation or display. It appeared through circulation. As Marco Polo continued his service and travel, he came to understand that prosperity here depended less on hoarding and more on movement of goods, labor, and information. Trade was not an isolated activity practiced at the margins of society. It was embedded within governance itself, shaped by policy and sustained by infrastructure. Marco's earliest impressions of wealth along the road had been tied to goods, spices, silks, metals, and stones that moved steadily from region to region. Over time, his attention shifted from objects to systems. He observed that what made trade viable across such distances was not abundance alone, but reliability. Routes were protected, rules were enforced. Obligations were known in advance. This predictability reduced risk and encouraged participation. Markets functioned as regulated spaces rather than chaotic gatherings. Prices fluctuated, but within recognizable bounds. Weights and measures were standardized across large regions. Marco noted how this standardization reduced disputes and accelerated exchange. Merchants did not need to renegotiate basic terms at every stop. Trust was institutional rather than personal. One of the most striking features of the economic system was the use of paper currency. Marco encountered this practice early in his residence at court, but its significance became clearer as he traveled. Paper money was issued under authority, backed by the state, and accepted throughout the empire. Its value rested on trust in the system rather than intrinsic material. Marco recognized how this facilitated large-scale trade by reducing the burden of transporting metal currency. The circulation of paper money required careful management. Issuance was controlled, counterfeiting was punished, acceptance was enforced through regulation. Marco observed that compliance was widespread, not because of fear alone, but because the system worked. Merchants could rely on currency being accepted elsewhere. This reliability expanded the scope of exchange. Trade routes extended across land and sea. Overland caravans connected inland regions, while maritime routes linked coastal centers. Marco observed how these routes complemented, rather than competed with one another. Goods moved along paths suited to their nature and destination. The state invested in maintaining both. Technological practices supported this movement. Marco noted innovations in shipbuilding that increased capacity and stability. He observed methods of navigation adapted to different waters. On land, he saw improvements in cart design and animal harnessing that increased efficiency. These technologies were not celebrated as breakthroughs, they were adopted because they worked. The postal system, which Marco encountered repeatedly, served economic as well as administrative functions. By ensuring rapid communication, it reduced uncertainty. Merchants could anticipate conditions ahead. Officials could respond to shortages or disruptions. Information moved faster than goods, allowing adjustment. Production within the empire was organized to meet demand. Marco observed agricultural practices adapted to local conditions. Irrigation systems increased yields. Storage facilities preserved surplus. These practices reduced vulnerability to seasonal variation. The state monitored production to anticipate needs. Craft industries thrived in urban centers. Marco observed workshops producing textiles, ceramics, paper, and metal goods. Specialization improved quality and consistency. Artisans worked within guild-like structures that regulated training and output. The state intervened when necessary to ensure supply for administrative needs. The relationship between the state and merchants was pragmatic. Trade was encouraged because it generated revenue and stability. Regulation ensured fairness and predictability. Marco noted that excessive interference was avoided. The state understood that over-regulation discouraged participation. Taxation was structured to support trade rather than stifle it. Rates were known. Collection followed procedure. Marco observed that predictability reduced resentment. Merchants planned around obligations rather than evading them. Technology also shaped daily life. Marco encountered tools and methods unfamiliar to him, but he described them in terms of function. He observed printing techniques that facilitated information dissemination. He noted construction methods suited to local materials. These practices reflected adaptation rather than novelty. The integration of technology and trade extended to logistics. Warehousing systems managed large volumes of goods. Inventory was tracked. Losses were minimized. Marco recognized that these practices required administrative competence. The flow of luxury goods did not obscure the importance of staples. Grain, salt, and textiles moved continuously. Marco observed how the state prioritized these essentials to maintain social stability. Shortages were addressed through redistribution. Economic diversity existed within the empire. Some regions specialized in production, others functioned as transit points. Marco learned to identify these roles through activity patterns. Wealth did not accumulate evenly, but opportunity did. The presence of foreign merchants within the empire illustrated its openness. Marco observed traders from distant regions operating under imperial protection. This diversity enriched markets and expanded networks. The state managed foreign participation through regulation rather than exclusion. Technological knowledge moved along trade routes. Practices spread through observation and adoption rather than formal transfer. Marco noted how effective methods were replicated. Ineffective ones faded. The scale of trade altered Marco's perception of distance. Goods moved across thousands of miles with relative regularity. This challenged European assumptions about isolation. Marco understood that connectivity existed long before later exploration. Economic administration required information. Marco observed how data on production, prices, and movement informed policy. Decisions were adjusted based on reports. This responsiveness reduced disruption. The state's role in fostering trade extended to security. Routes were patrolled, banditry was suppressed. Marco recognized that safety was an economic investment. Trade flourished where risk was managed. Technological adaptation also appeared in agriculture. Marco observed crop rotation, irrigation, and soil management practices. These techniques increased resilience. The state promoted methods that sustained productivity. The use of paper records complemented currency. Contracts were documented, accounts were maintained. Marco noted how literacy and numeracy supported economic complexity. Despite the sophistication, the system was not rigid. Flexibility allowed adaptation to changing conditions. Marco observed policy adjustments in response to drought, conflict, or market shifts. Wealth within this world was not concentrated solely at the court. It circulated through regions, supporting local economies. Marco observed how prosperity reinforced loyalty by improving livelihoods. The visibility of wealth varied. Some regions displayed abundance openly, others emphasized modesty. Marco did not equate display with prosperity, he assessed stability instead. Technology also influenced time management. Calendars coordinated agricultural and administrative cycles. Marco observed how synchronization supported planning. The cumulative effect of these systems impressed Marco. He recognized that wealth here was sustained by coordination rather than conquest alone. Trade was an instrument of governance. These observations would later inform his accounts. He would describe economic practices that challenged European expectations. His descriptions would emphasize functionality over marvel. As Marco continued his service, wealth, trade, and technology remained constant themes. They shaped the empire's resilience. They underpinned its administration. The journey forward would reveal how these systems interacted with belief, law, and culture. For now, Marco understood that prosperity here was not accidental. It was designed, belief, custom, and law. As Marco Polo continued to move within the Mongol world, belief, custom, and law revealed themselves not as abstract ideas, but as practical forces shaping daily life. These elements did not dominate his experience through debate or conflict. Instead, they operated quietly, setting boundaries, resolving disputes, and allowing diverse populations to function within a shared framework. For Marco, raised in a Europe often defined by religious division and legal fragmentation, this environment required careful attention. Religious belief within the empire did not conform to a single doctrine. Marco encountered Buddhist monks, Muslim scholars, Christian communities, practitioners of traditional rites, and groups whose beliefs did not fit easily into familiar categories. What distinguished this diversity was not its novelty, but its management. The state did not demand uniformity of belief, it demanded order. As long as religious practice did not interfere with taxation, communication, or stability, it was tolerated. Marco observed that religious institutions often served social functions beyond worship. Temples, mosques, and churches acted as centers of learning, charity, and community organization. They provided structure at the local level, reducing the administrative burden on the state. This practical contribution explained, in part, why tolerance was maintained. Suppression would have disrupted useful systems. The state's relationship with religious leaders was measured. Leaders were consulted on matters affecting their communities, but they did not dictate policy. Marco noted that this separation reduced competition for authority. Belief remained personal or communal rather than political. This arrangement contrasted sharply with European struggles between secular and religious power. Custom varied widely across regions. Marco encountered differences in dress, diet, marriage practices, and social hierarchy. These customs were not erased by imperial rule. They persisted alongside administrative requirements. Marco learned that the empire's strength lay in allowing local identity to remain intact while integrating it into broader systems. Law functioned as the connective tissue binding this diversity together. Marco observed that legal expectations were communicated clearly. Laws were not uniform in detail, but they adhered to common principles. Crimes against property, disruption of trade, and resistance to authority were addressed consistently. This consistency mattered more than identical procedure. Legal authority flowed through appointed officials rather than hereditary judges. Marco observed that officials were accountable for enforcement. Their performance was evaluated. This accountability reduced arbitrariness. While abuses occurred, the The system provided mechanisms for correction. Dispute resolution emphasized restoration over punishment. Marco noted that many conflicts were settled through compensation rather than imprisonment or execution. This approach preserved economic productivity and social stability. Severe punishment was reserved for actions that threatened order. Customary law continued to operate at local levels, provided it did not conflict with imperial priorities. Marco observed that communities resolved internal matters according to tradition. The state intervened only when necessary. This balance reduced resistance. The administration of justice relied heavily on documentation. Records of decisions were maintained. Marco noted that written evidence carried weight. This emphasis on record-keeping reduced reliance on memory or status. It also facilitated oversight. Language again played a role in legal proceedings. Interpreters ensured understanding. Marco observed that patience was exercised to avoid misunderstanding. Speed was valued less than accuracy. Religious festivals and customs were observed publicly without interference. Marco noted how these events reinforced community bonds. The state accommodated them by adjusting schedules rather than suppressing them. This accommodation fostered goodwill. Moral codes varied. What constituted acceptable behavior in one region differed in another. Marco learned not to apply a single standard. He observed how law addressed actions rather than intentions. This focus reduced moral conflict. The empire's legal system prioritized predictability. Marco noted that people understood consequences. This understanding reduced disputes. Fear was not the primary motivator. Expectation was. Education about law occurred informally. Communities learned through experience. Officials communicated expectations through example rather than instruction. Marco observed how this practical approach maintained order. Punishments, when applied, were measured. Public display was limited. Marco noted that excessive severity was avoided because it disrupted productivity and loyalty. The state valued continuity. Belief systems coexisted with legal authority without merging. Marco observed that religious leaders did not enforce law. Officials did not dictate belief. This separation reduced conflict. The treatment of foreigners reflected legal pragmatism. Marco observed that foreigners were subject to law but granted protections. Trade agreements were honored. Disputes involving foreigners were addressed through procedure rather than exclusion. Custom also shaped economic behavior. Marco noted practices governing trade ethics, labor obligations, and social responsibility. These customs complemented formal law. Together, they sustained stability. The role of family varied across regions. Marco observed different inheritance practices and household structures. Law accommodated these variations rather than imposing uniformity. Gender roles differed. Marco noted women participating in economic and social life in ways unfamiliar to him. Law recognized these roles pragmatically. The empire's tolerance extended to belief, but not to disorder. Marco observed swift response to rebellion or banditry. Law protected stability first. As Marco traveled, he saw how belief, custom, and law intersected differently in each region, yet the overarching framework remained consistent. This consistency allowed diversity without fragmentation. The legal system adapted to scale. Local matters were resolved locally. Regional issues escalated. Central authority intervened selectively. Marco observed how this prevented overload. The absence of ideological enforcement reduced resistance. Marco recognized that people complied because the system worked. Law served practical needs. Belief influenced daily routines, but did not disrupt administration. Marco observed how prayer schedules and rituals were integrated into work without conflict. The state's neutrality in belief matters reduced violence. Marco contrasted this with European conflicts he had known indirectly. This contrast deepened his appreciation for pragmatism. Customs regarding hospitality, negotiation, and honor shaped interactions. Marco learned to respect these norms to avoid misunderstanding. Law supported these customs by acknowledging them. As years passed, Marco internalized this pluralistic environment. He learned that order did not require uniformity, it required coordination. These observations informed his later accounts. He would describe belief systems without judgment. He He would note customs without exaggeration. He would explain law as function. Belief, custom, and law formed a quiet framework beneath the empire's visible systems. They sustained daily life without spectacle. By the end of this phase, Marco understood that governance here depended on accommodation rather than domination. This understanding refined his perspective. The journey forward would carry him further from home in time, as well as distance. These lessons would shape how he interpreted that separation, distance from home. As the years accumulated within the Mongol world, distance from home became less a matter of geography and more a condition of time. Marco Polo no longer measured separation by miles traveled or routes crossed. He measured it by seasons completed, assignments fulfilled, and the quiet realization that the rhythms of his life no longer aligned with those of Venice. Home had not vanished from memory, but it no longer shaped daily expectation. Communication with Europe was effectively impossible. Letters could not be exchanged with reliability. News travelled slowly and often incompletely. Marco understood that events in Venice, births, deaths, political shifts, would reach him, if at all, long after their relevance had passed. This absence of information altered emotional orientation. He learned to live without anticipation of reply. Attention settled on the present. The passing of time within service was steady rather than marked. There were no anniversaries celebrated, no rituals acknowledging years spent abroad. Marco aged quietly. His youth receded without announcement. Responsibilities increased subtly, not through promotion but through trust. He became accustomed to the idea that life progressed through function rather than milestone. Memory began to change character. Venice remained vivid in certain details. The sound of water against stone, the cadence of familiar speech, but these memories were no longer refreshed by experience. They existed as fixed images. Marco noticed that when he recalled home, he did so selectively. Certain scenes repeated, others faded, memory simplified. The sense of belonging also shifted. Marco did not replace Venice with another homeland. He did not adopt a new identity rooted in place. Instead, he developed a form of belonging tied to role. His sense of position came from understanding expectations and fulfilling them. This functional belonging provided stability without sentiment. Cultural habits from Venice persisted quietly. Marco retained preferences in food, routine, and comportment, but he did not insist upon them. Adaptation had become habitual. He selected what could be maintained without friction and released what could not. This selective retention preserved equilibrium. The awareness of distance intensified during periods of illness or rest, when activity slowed and reflection emerged uninvited. During these intervals, Marco recognized that his life had diverged significantly from what might have unfolded had he remained in Venice. This recognition did not provoke regret. It produced acknowledgement. Marco understood that return was not guaranteed. The empire's stability could not be assumed indefinitely. Political conditions might change. Opportunities might close. He accepted this uncertainty without anxiety. The road had taught him to live without assurances. Time also altered relationships. The bond with his father and uncle, once central, became contextual. They shared experience and responsibility, but Marco's identity no longer depended on familial proximity. He had grown into autonomy within service. The accumulation of distance also reshaped Marco's perception of Europe. He no longer viewed it as the center from which other regions deviated. It became one region among many, with its own systems and constraints. This relativization reduced longing. Home was no longer idealized. It was contextualized. The environment of the court reinforced this orientation. Daily routines demanded attention. Reports required accuracy. Assignments required readiness. These demands left little space for nostalgia. Reflection occurred, but it did not dominate. Marco observed other foreigners at court and within the empire. Some remained oriented toward return, speaking frequently of home. Others adapted fully, relinquishing reference. Marco occupied a middle position. He remembered without dwelling. He adapted without forgetting. The sense of time passing was most evident in physical change. Marco noted shifts in endurance, perception, and patience. Experience refined judgment. He recognized patterns more quickly. He anticipated outcomes. These changes signaled maturation rather than decline. Distance from home also influenced Marco's understanding of loyalty. His allegiance was not rooted in place but in obligation. He fulfilled duties because they were assigned, not because they were symbolic. This pragmatic loyalty aligned with imperial expectations. The absence of news from Europe reduced emotional volatility. There were no sudden shocks or celebrations. Life progressed evenly. This steadiness supported sleep, focus, and composure. Marco adapted to a life without abrupt interruption. At times, memories of Venice surfaced unexpectedly, prompted by a familiar smell, a cadence of speech, or a reflection on water. These moments were brief. They did not disrupt equilibrium. They reminded without pulling. Marco's sense of identity became layered. He was Venetian by origin, but not by daily experience. He was a servant of the empire, but not bound by ambition. He was a traveller, but not in motion. This layered identity reduced dependence on any single definition. The passage of years also influenced Marco's understanding of purpose. He did not pursue meaning abstractly. Purpose emerged through usefulness. His reports mattered. His observations informed decisions. This contribution anchored his life. Distance from home reduced external comparison. Marco no longer measured success against peers in Venice. He measured it against expectations within his role. This internal standard reduced dissatisfaction. The environment encouraged acceptance. The court did not reward emotional display. It rewarded consistency. Marco internalized this value. He maintained composure without effort. Occasionally, Marco encountered travelers newly arrived from Europe. Their assumptions and questions highlighted his own transformation. He recognized how much his perspective had shifted. These encounters reinforced the distance not only spatial but cognitive. The idea of return persisted abstractly. It was acknowledged but not planned. Marco understood that return would require alignment of conditions beyond personal desire. This acceptance prevented frustration. As years accumulated, Marco's memories of Europe ceased to update. They remained static. In contrast, his understanding of Asia continued to evolve. This imbalance shaped his orientation toward the present rather than the past. The sense of distance also affected language. Marco's use of Venetian speech became less frequent. Other languages dominated daily interaction. He retained his native tongue internally, but it was no longer reinforced socially. This linguistic shift further altered identity. Language shaped thought. Marco noticed that certain concepts were expressed differently across tongues. This multiplicity expanded his cognitive range. Distance from home did not produce isolation. Marco remained integrated within a system. He was surrounded by activity and purpose. Loneliness, when it occurred, was brief and situational. The court's rhythm supported this integration. There was always work. There was always movement of information. Marco's attention remained engaged. The idea of legacy did not occupy Marco's thoughts during this period. He did not imagine future readers. He focused on present responsibility. This focus preserved clarity. Distance also altered emotional resilience. Marco learned to regulate response. Without external emotional anchors, he relied on routine and observation. This self-regulation sustained stability. As time progressed, Marco's life felt continuous rather than segmented. There was no clear boundary between past and present. Experience accumulated without narrative framing. This continuity would later influence how he recounted his life. He would describe processes rather than arcs. He would emphasize systems rather than turning points. Distance from home thus became an environment rather than a condition. Marco lived within it comfortably. It shaped him without distress. The absence of dramatic longing or crisis did not diminish the significance of this separation. It defined his adult life quietly. It oriented his perspective outward. By the end of this phase, Marco had spent more of his life beyond Venice than within it. This fact did not surprise him. It had occurred gradually. The journey forward would eventually raise the question of return more concretely. For now, distance remained accepted, integrated, and unremarked. The decision to return west did not emerge suddenly, nor did it arrive as the result of a single event. It formed slowly, shaped by changes within the empire, shifts at court, and the quiet accumulation of years spent in service. For Marco Polo, return was not framed as a longing fulfilled or an escape sought. It was a practical conclusion drawn from altered conditions. The Mongol world Marco had come to know was not static. Though its administrative systems remained effective, the political environment began to change subtly. Leadership aged, court dynamics adjusted, priorities shifted. Marco observed that continuity depended on constant recalibration, and that periods of stability were finite. This awareness did not provoke alarm, it prompted assessment. One factor influencing the possibility of return was succession. As the great Khan grew older, questions of inheritance and governance became more prominent. Marco observed how attention gradually turned inward, toward consolidation and preparation. Opportunities for foreigners to remain embedded within the system narrowed. The court's focus sharpened around internal concerns. Marco's role, while still valued, no longer expanded. Assignments continued, but they carried less strategic weight. He recognized this not as a decline in trust, but as a natural adjustment. The system no longer required his particular perspective in the same way. This realization clarified his position. His father and uncle shared this assessment. Their long absence from Europe had always been contingent rather than permanent. The idea of return resurfaced not as nostalgia, but as unfinished business. Property, obligations, and identity remained unresolved in Venice. These matters required attention. The decision was also influenced by fatigue, though not exhaustion. Marco did not experience weariness as collapse. He experienced it as completion. The work he had been equipped to do had been done. Observation had accumulated. Responsibility had been met. Permission to depart was not assumed. It required alignment with court priorities. The Mongol administration valued continuity and did not encourage unnecessary movement. Marco understood that departure would need justification that did not imply disloyalty. This consideration shaped how the request was framed. The opportunity arose through circumstance rather than request alone. Diplomatic missions, logistical needs, and the movement of goods created openings. Marco and his companions positioned themselves within these flows. Return became feasible when it aligned with imperial interests. The approval to leave was granted without ceremony. There was no farewell audience or recognition of service. This absence of ritual reinforced the nature of Marco's relationship with the court. It had been functional rather than personal. Departure followed the same principle. Preparation for return required renewed attention to logistics. Routes were assessed, timing was calculated, supplies were arranged. Marco approached this preparation with familiarity. He had planned journeys before, yet this journey differed in orientation. It faced west. The prospect of return did not produce immediate emotional response. Marco did not anticipate reunion vividly. Years of distance had softened expectation. Home existed as memory rather than destination. Return was an objective, not an emotional climax. The court environment responded to the decision with neutrality. Officials adjusted records. Responsibilities were reassigned. Marco observed that systems absorbed change without disruption. This efficiency reinforced his respect for the administration. As departure approached, Marco became aware of the finality of certain experiences. Routes he had traveled repeatedly would not be traversed again. Relationships formed through service would dissolve without formal closure. This awareness was acknowledged without sentiment. The journey west would not retrace the original path exactly. Conditions had changed. Opportunities differed. Marco understood that return was not reversal. It was continuation under altered circumstances. The departure itself was unremarkable. Movement resumed along established routes. Marco transitioned from resident to traveller without ceremony. The system accommodated this shift smoothly. As he moved away from the court, Marco reflected not on loss, but on completeness. The years spent within the empire formed a coherent period. They did not require extension. They did not demand return. They existed intact. The road west presented familiar challenges in new configurations. Geography had not changed, but Marco had. He approached distance with greater economy of attention. He knew which details mattered. He anticipated obstacles. The decision to return also sharpened Marco's awareness of what he carried with him. He did not transport only goods. He carried accumulated observation, structured understanding, and memory shaped by long residence. These intangible elements would prove more consequential than cargo. Marco did not yet consider how his experiences would be received in Europe. He did not anticipate disbelief or influence. His concern remained practical, completion of the journey. As the caravan progressed, Marco encountered regions now familiar through repetition. Yet familiarity did not breed disregard. He noted subtle changes, new officials, adjusted policies, altered trade patterns. The empire continued to evolve without him. The return journey was slower in some respects. The weight of years added caution. Health was managed carefully. Pace was adjusted. Marco prioritized sustainability over speed. The sense of direction influenced perception. Traveling west altered Marco's orientation toward landscape and time. What had once been approach now became passage. This shift did not intensify emotion. It clarified purpose. The decision to return also altered Marco's internal narrative. He began to organize memory more consciously. Experiences aligned themselves into sequences. Observation accumulated into understanding. This internal ordering occurred quietly. As Marco moved farther from the center of Mongol authority, administrative support gradually thinned. Yet systems remained present. Infrastructure persisted. The empire's reach did not vanish abruptly. It receded gradually. The awareness of leaving a system he understood deeply did not provoke anxiety. Marco trusted his adaptability. He had learned to function within unfamiliar frameworks. Europe would be one more such framework, albeit one he once knew. The return journey required negotiation of identity. Marco was no longer simply Venetian. He was not entirely of the Mongol world. He occupied an intermediate position shaped by experience. This ambiguity did not trouble him. The decision to return thus marked a transition without rupture. It did not conclude a story. It shifted its setting. The continuity of Marco's life remained intact. As the road extended westward, Marco accepted the uncertainty ahead. He did not anticipate recognition. He did not expect ease. He accepted return as responsibility rather than reward. The decision had been made. The journey proceeded. What awaited at its end remained undefined. The long way back. The journey west unfolded with a different weight than the one that had carried Marco Polo east. Distance no longer felt like an unknown to be entered, but a space to be crossed with care. Years of experience had reshaped his approach to travel. He no longer learned the road as he went. He recognized its patterns, anticipated its demands, and adjusted to its constraints with practiced economy. The way back was not a reversal. It was a continuation under altered conditions. The first stages of departure from the court did not feel like escape. Administrative support eased gradually, rather than ending abruptly. Documents remained valid for long stretches. Way stations continued to provide assistance. The empire's infrastructure did not recede suddenly. It thinned in layers. This gradual withdrawal reflected the same administrative logic that had governed Marco's service. Systems absorbed change without disruption. The route west required strategic choice. Conditions differed from those of the earlier journey. Political circumstances had shifted. Some paths were less secure, others had improved. Marco and his companions weighed these variables carefully. The goal was not speed alone, it was continuity. A journey interrupted by crisis would jeopardize everything that followed. The sea became part of the return in ways it had not been before. Maritime routes offered alternatives to overland travel, reducing exposure to certain risks while introducing others. Marco approached the sea without romantic attachment. It was a medium of transport governed by weather, maintenance, and timing. Ships required preparation, crews required coordination, schedules yielded to conditions. The passage by sea demanded patience of a different kind. Wind patterns dictated movement. Waiting became unavoidable. Marco understood that forcing departure invited failure. He accepted delay as part of the method rather than an obstacle. The rhythm of maritime travel reinforced lessons learned earlier on land. Loss occurred along the way, not through dramatic catastrophe, but through attrition. Illness claimed travelers. Accidents reduced capacity. Supplies spoiled or were consumed more quickly than planned. Marco observed these losses with restraint. They were accounted for, adjusted around, and absorbed. The journey continued. Encounters with coastal regions introduced new administrative contexts. Authority shifted. Local systems replaced imperial ones. Marco navigated these transitions by observing procedure and adapting. He did not assume continuity where it did not exist. He learned to identify where new rules applied and to comply accordingly. The return journey brought Marco into contact with travelers moving eastward. These encounters highlighted the asymmetry of experience. Those heading east carried anticipation. Those returning carried accumulation. Marco recognized this difference without comment. He no longer projected expectation onto others. Overland travel resumed intermittently. Familiar challenges returned in modified form. Deserts still demanded restraint. Mountains still imposed pace. Marco's body responded differently now. Experience guided effort. He conserved energy deliberately. He recognized limits earlier. This prudence preserved momentum. The management of health became central. Years of travel had taught Marco to recognize early signs of strain. He adjusted diet, rest, and pace accordingly. This attention reduced severe interruption. The journey became an exercise in maintenance rather than endurance. Administrative boundaries multiplied as the journey progressed westward. Authority fragmented. Documentation required renewal. Permissions had to be renegotiated. Marco navigated these transitions using experience rather than force. He recognized when compliance facilitated movement and when negotiation was required. Markets along the route differed from those he had known earlier. Trade patterns had shifted. Goods moved in altered volumes. Marco observed these changes with interest but without analysis. They indicated broader shifts beyond his immediate concern. The world continued to change independently of his journey. The sense of time altered again. Seasons passed more quickly as familiar patterns reasserted themselves. Marco measured progress by milestones remembered from earlier travel. Recognition replaced discovery. This familiarity reduced cognitive strain. The journey west also reintroduced cultural elements that had receded during long residence in the east. Languages, customs, and religious practices aligned more closely with Marco's early memories. Yet they did not feel entirely familiar. Distance had altered perception. What once felt natural now required adjustment. Marco did not attempt to reclaim earlier identity during this phase. He did not adopt European habits immediately. He retained practices that had proven effective. This selective adaptation preserved stability. The accumulation of experience affected judgment. Marco evaluated risk more conservatively. He avoided unnecessary exposure. He chose routes that prioritized reliability over novelty. This pragmatism reflected a matured orientation. The emotional landscape of the return remained subdued. Marco did not imagine reunions vividly. He did not anticipate recognition. His focus remained on completion. Emotion did not precede arrival. It awaited confirmation. Encounters with authority outside the Mongol framework required careful navigation. Officials assessed travelers differently. Marco adjusted his presentation accordingly. He emphasized documentation, purpose, and compliance. This reduced suspicion. The return journey also involved managing expectations within the traveling group. Fatigue varied. Motivation fluctuated. Marco observed these dynamics and adjusted coordination. Leadership emerged through steadiness rather than command. As the journey progressed, the empire's reach diminished visibly. Infrastructure thinned. Security depended more on local arrangements. Marco recognized this transition as inevitable. It did not provoke concern. He adjusted planning accordingly. The sea again offered passage toward Europe. Maritime routes carried different risks than before. Weather remained unpredictable. Marco approached these crossings with caution. He selected timing carefully. He accepted delay when conditions required. During long periods at sea, memory surfaced differently. The absence of landmarks encouraged reflection. Marco did not dwell on past decisions. He allowed memory to surface and recede without engagement. This neutrality preserved focus. The return journey reintroduced Marco to forms of authority defined by lineage and tradition rather than administration. He observed these systems without judgment. He recognized their logic within context. The gradual approach to Europe altered Marco's orientation subtly. He began to anticipate translation of experience into language, of observation into explanation. This anticipation remained indistinct. He did not yet frame narrative. He prepared mentally without conscious intention. Loss continued to shape the journey. Some companions did not complete it. Their absence was acknowledged quietly. The group adjusted. Continuity prevailed. The logistics of carrying accumulated goods required constant attention. Cargo had to be protected. Documentation had to be maintained. Marco approached this task with care. He understood that tangible goods represented effort as well as value. The approach to familiar regions did not restore familiarity fully. Landscapes resembled memory, but context differed. Political arrangements had changed, Marco observed without expectation of continuity. The return journey demanded patience of a different kind. Anticipation, when it surfaced, had to be managed. Marco understood that premature expectation increased strain. He delayed emotional investment. As Europe drew nearer, administrative processes became more fragmented. Borders multiplied. Permissions varied. Marco navigated these complexities through experience rather than urgency. The final stages of the journey compressed time perceptually. Progress felt both slow and accelerated. Familiarity increased, but completion remained distant. Marco maintained steadiness. The long way back did not offer closure. It extended experience. It tested adaptability under new conditions. It confirmed lessons learned earlier. By the time Marco approached the western edges of the known routes, he had traversed not only distance but transition. He carried with him a perspective shaped by systems, observation, and restraint. The journey continued, nearing its conclusion without announcing it. The road did not end. It narrowed. Venice rediscovered. The arrival in Venice did not unfold as a moment of recognition, nor did it present itself as a return to familiarity. It emerged gradually, through approach rather than arrival, through recognition of outlines rather than emotional confirmation. After years of movement governed by roads, deserts, ports, and administrative boundaries, the city appeared not as a destination, but as another environment to be understood. Marco Polo did not step back into Venice as he had left it. He encountered it as a place that had continued without him. The city itself bore the marks of time. Buildings remained, but their context had shifted. Political alliances had adjusted. Trade patterns had evolved. The movement of ships followed rhythms altered by years of change. Marco observed these differences with attentiveness rather than surprise. He understood that absence had consequences not only for the traveller, but for the place left behind. Venice had not been waiting. It had not preserved itself in memory. The markets were active. The docks were crowded. Goods flowed through familiar channels with altered emphasis. Marco recognized the structure, but not the emphasis. Certain trades had expanded, others had declined. The city's orientation had adjusted in response to conditions Marco had not witnessed. The reception Marco encountered was restrained. There was no formal recognition of distance traveled or experience gained. His appearance did not prompt celebration. This absence of ceremony aligned with Venetian pragmatism. Identity was established through current position rather than past movement. Marco accepted this without disappointment. He had not expected otherwise. Family ties required renewal. Relationships defined by proximity had softened through years of absence. Relatives had aged. New figures had entered family structures. Marco approached these changes with patience. He did not attempt to reclaim earlier roles immediately. He allowed relationships to recalibrate. Language itself felt altered. Venetian speech remained intelligible, but its cadence felt unfamiliar. Marco noticed pauses where once there had been fluency. His vocabulary had shifted subtly through years of multilingual use. He adapted deliberately, listening before speaking. This attentiveness reduced friction. The material culture of Venice felt both familiar and distant. Clothing styles had evolved, tools had changed incrementally. Marco observed these shifts without judgment. He understood that adaptation was continuous. His own habits reflected years of adjustment. He did not attempt to conform immediately. Venetian governance though stable, differed in tone from the administration Marco had known. Authority here was negotiated through councils, alliances, and precedent. Decisions unfolded through debate rather than directive. Marco observed this contrast with interest. He recognized strengths and limitations without comparison. Trade remained central to Venetian life. Merchants assessed value carefully. Contracts governed exchange. Marco recognized these mechanisms instinctively, yet he also noticed differences in scale and coordination. Trade here operated within narrower networks. Risk was managed differently. Information moved more slowly. Marco's experiences had altered his expectations of administration. He no longer assumed fragmentation as inevitable. He observed Venetian governance with fresh perspective, noting where coordination succeeded and where it faltered. This observation remained internal. He did not articulate critique. The city's social rhythms required adjustment. Marco had grown accustomed to environments where routine dominated. Venice balanced routine with negotiation. Schedules were flexible. Obligations were renegotiated frequently. Marco adapted by slowing his internal tempo. He aligned his pace with the city's. The sense of anonymity was unexpected. Marco had anticipated recognition based on family name or travel. Instead, he encountered indifference. This indifference was not hostility. It reflected Venetian emphasis on current utility. Marco accepted this framework. He did not assert his experience. He observed. Material wealth carried home required careful management. Goods accumulated during years abroad had to be assessed, secured, and integrated into Venetian commerce. Marco approached this process methodically. He understood the importance of documentation and trust. He avoided haste. The process of reintegration extended beyond commerce. Social networks had shifted. Alliances had formed and dissolved. Marco observed these dynamics cautiously. He did not attempt immediate engagement. He prioritized understanding current alignments. Venice's religious life continued with familiar structure. Churches marked time. Rituals punctuated the year. Marco participated without emphasis. His understanding of belief had broadened. He approached religious practice with measured attention. The city's physical environment elicited memory without dominance. Canals reflected light as before. Stone surfaces retained texture, yet Marco did not linger on nostalgia. He allowed recognition to occur without attachment. This restraint preserved equilibrium. The idea of home required redefinition. Marco no longer experienced Venice as origin. He experienced it as context. This shift did not diminish connection. It altered expectation. Home became one environment among others, rather than a central reference. Venetian society assessed individuals through contribution. Marco understood this. He did not expect accommodation based on absence. He accepted the need to demonstrate relevance within current conditions. This acceptance aligned with his experience of other systems. The accumulation of years abroad manifested in subtle ways. Marco's comportment reflected restraint. His speech emphasized clarity. He avoided exaggeration. These traits distinguished him quietly. They did not immediately elevate his status. The city's pace required recalibration. Marco adjusted to shorter distances, frequent interaction, and denser social contact. This adaptation demanded attention. He managed it deliberately. Memory of the East remained present but unexpressed. Marco did not recount experiences spontaneously. He recognized that context mattered. He waited for appropriate circumstances. This discretion reduced misunderstanding. The absence of immediate validation did not trouble Marco. He had learned that significance was not conferred through recognition alone. It emerged through function. He remained attentive to opportunity. Venice's legal and economic systems required renewed familiarity. Marco reviewed procedures, obligations, and expectations. He understood that absence had created gaps. He filled them through observation rather than assertion. The city's response to foreign goods was pragmatic. Exotic items were assessed for value, not novelty. Marco recognized this orientation. He avoided embellishment. He presented goods through function. The return also required adjustment to European political tensions. Alliances shifted, conflicts simmered. Marco observed these dynamics without engagement. He recognized that his experience did not grant authority here. He observed. Time passed unevenly during this reintegration. Days felt dense. Progress occurred incrementally. Marco accepted this pace. He did not rush toward closure. The absence of clear role challenged Marco subtly. He had functioned within defined systems for years. Venice offered no immediate equivalent. Marco adapted by observing needs rather than seeking position. The idea of narration began to form indistinctly. Marco recognized that his experiences constituted information. He did not yet frame it as story. He recognized utility. This recognition remained internal. Venice did not mirror Marco's transformation. It reflected its own continuity. This contrast clarified difference without conflict. Marco accepted divergence. The process of rediscovery continued. Venice unfolded gradually, not as memory restored, but as environment engaged. Marco's attention remained steady. The city offered no resolution. It offered context. Marco remained attentive, patient, and adaptable. These qualities guided him as they always had. Venice rediscovered Marco as one among many. Marco rediscovered Venice as one system among others. This mutual recognition occurred quietly: prison and memory. The turn that carried Marco Polo from private reintegration into public recollection did not arise from deliberate choice. It emerged from circumstance shaped by conflict, obligation, and the unpredictable consequences of belonging to a city whose fortunes were tied to rivalry. Venice, stable as it appeared from within, existed within a network of competing powers. Trade routes overlapped, alliances shifted, disputes escalated. Marco returned to a city whose external pressures had intensified during his absence. Venice's conflict with Genoa formed the immediate context. The rivalry between the two maritime republics was not new, but it had sharpened. Competition for trade, influence, and territory produced cycles of confrontation. Marco, like other Venetian men of standing, was drawn into this environment not through ambition but through expectation. Civic obligation required participation. The transition from merchant environment to conflict was abrupt. The structured systems Marco had known within the Mongol world gave way to conditions defined by contingency. Engagements at sea carried risk unmediated by administrative predictability. Marco approached this environment with caution, but experience could not eliminate uncertainty. Capture occurred without ceremony. In the chaos of naval conflict, identity mattered less than affiliation. Marco was taken to Genoa as a prisoner, along with many others. This confinement marked a shift in his life that contrasted sharply with previous transitions. For the first time in many years, his movement was restricted not by geography or obligation, but by force. Prison life did not resemble the dramatic scenes later imagination would supply. It was structured, monotonous, and uncertain. Prisoners were held under conditions that reflected practical concerns rather than cruelty. Space was limited. Time was unstructured. Days blended into one another without clear markers. For Marco, this confinement produced a different kind of stillness. The road had always offered forward motion. Service had provided purpose. Prison removed both. The absence of assigned function created space for recollection. Memory, long subordinated to observation, moved forward. The environment of captivity encouraged conversation among prisoners, though Marco did not initially position himself as narrator. He listened. Others spoke of battles, grievances, and plans. Marco observed that memory in this context often emphasized personal loss or justification. He did not immediately contribute. Over time, attention shifted toward Marco's experiences. Word of his travels circulated among prisoners. Curiosity emerged. Questions were asked not through interrogation but through sustained interest. Marco recognized that his accumulated observation represented information unavailable to others. The act of recounting did not begin as storytelling. It began as clarification. Marco responded to questions factually. He described routes, cities, systems. He avoided embellishment. This restraint distinguished his accounts. It encouraged further inquiry. The presence of Rustichello of Pisa within the prison environment altered the process. Rustichello possessed experience in recording narrative, though his background lay in romance rather than administration. The collaboration that emerged was pragmatic. Marco provided content. Rustichello structured it. This process did not transform Marco into an author in the modern sense. He did not conceive of a book as a personal statement. He responded to prompts. He clarified points. He corrected inaccuracies. The narrative formed through interaction rather than solitary composition. Memory functioned differently under confinement. Without new experiences to occupy attention, recollection became more detailed. Marco noticed that certain observations resurfaced repeatedly. Administrative routines, trade practices, urban organization. These patterns reflected what had mattered most during service. The act of recollection imposed order on experience. Marco began to sequence events, not chronologically alone, but functionally. He grouped information by theme rather than time. This organization mirrored his administrative perspective. Prison imposed limitations that shaped narration. Access to reference was impossible. Marco relied entirely on memory. This constraint reinforced selectivity. He focused on what he understood most clearly. He avoided speculation. Rustichello's role introduced narrative structure unfamiliar to Marco. Episodes were framed. Transitions were added. Marco remained attentive to accuracy. He corrected excess. The resulting account balanced factual description with narrative coherence. The prison environment also influenced tone. There was no audience expecting marvel. There was an audience seeking understanding. Marco's descriptions retained restraint. He did not dramatize. He explained. Time within prison passed unevenly. Days stretched. Recollection filled space. The act of recounting provided structure. It offered purpose without obligation. Marco recognized this benefit without idealizing it. The awareness that his experiences might circulate beyond the prison did not immediately register. Marco did not imagine readership. He responded to present conditions. The narrative existed as conversation extended. The prison also equalized status. Marco's prior service and travel did not grant privilege. Within confinement, credibility derived from coherence. His accounts held attention because they aligned internally. Consistency reinforced trust. The collaboration progressed intermittently. Interruptions occurred. Conditions shifted. The narrative did not advance linearly. It accumulated gradually, shaped by available time and mutual effort. Memory itself proved adaptive. Marco noticed that certain details sharpened through repetition, others faded. He learned to distinguish between what he had seen and what he had inferred. He clarified this distinction when possible. The prison context discouraged exaggeration. Claims could be challenged immediately. Fellow prisoners questioned plausibility. Marco responded with explanation. This dynamic reinforced precision. The absence of external validation shaped Marco's orientation. He did not perform, he explained. The difference mattered. It preserved the character of the account. Over time, the narrative acquired a degree of independence from Marco's immediate presence. Rustichello shaped it into a form that could circulate. Marco reviewed content where possible. He ensured alignment with observation. The prison period thus transformed memory into record. This transformation occurred without intention. It was a response to stillness and inquiry. Marco did not consider how future readers might interpret the account. He did not anticipate skepticism or fascination. He focused on clarity. The experience of confinement also reinforced lessons learned earlier. Systems mattered. Order sustained stability. Their absence produced uncertainty. Marco observed prison administration with the same attention he had applied elsewhere. Release eventually came through negotiation rather than escape. The conflict that had produced captivity shifted. Conditions changed. Marco emerged from prison altered not in identity but in orientation. He carried with him a narrative, now partially externalized. The transition from prisoner to civilian did not immediately restore agency. The narrative continued to exist beyond Marco's control. Copies circulated, variations emerged. Marco observed this with restraint. The prison period did not define Marco's life as trauma or triumph. It served as conduit. It allowed experience to be recorded. Memory, once functional, had become communicable. This shift marked a new phase, a book that traveled far. The account that emerged from Marco Polo's years of observation did not settle into a single, fixed form. It moved, changed, and adapted as it passed from hand to hand. language to language, and context to context. What had begun as recollection shaped by circumstance became a document shaped by transmission. Marco did not oversee this process in any sustained way. He observed it from within his own life, aware that something he had contributed now existed beyond his control. The text that circulated came to be known in various forms and under various titles, most commonly as Il Milione. Its name reflected neither authorship nor intention in a modern sense. It was not conceived as a memoir, nor as a work of instruction. It was a record assembled through conversation, structured for coherence, and released into a world eager for information about regions largely unknown to Europe. The early circulation of the book followed the paths available to manuscripts in the late medieval world. Copies were produced by hand. Variations appeared almost immediately. Scribes adjusted phrasing. Translators rendered meaning rather than exact wording. Additions and omissions occurred. The text did not fragment because it lacked coherence. It fragmented because it was alive within a culture of reproduction that valued accessibility over uniformity. Marco did not attempt to standardize the account. He lacked both the means and the inclination. He understood that once written, the text belonged to those who copied and read it. This acceptance aligned with his broader orientation towards systems rather than control. He had provided information. What followed was process. Readers encountered the book through their own expectations. Some approached it as geography, others read it as commerce, still others treated it as wonder. Marco's restrained descriptions allowed for these varied interpretations. He did not dictate response. He described conditions. Readers supplied emphasis. The book's reception varied by region. In commercial centers, merchants read it for practical insight. They noted descriptions of routes, goods, and markets. In scholarly contexts, it was examined alongside existing geographical knowledge. Discrepancies were noted. Questions arose. In courts, it was read as intelligence about distant powers. Skepticism accompanied interest. Certain descriptions challenged European assumptions too directly to be accepted without hesitation. Large cities, organized administration, paper currency, and religious tolerance contradicted familiar narratives. Some readers dismissed these accounts as exaggeration. Others accepted them cautiously. The book did not resolve debate. It provoked it. The absence of authorial commentary contributed to this ambiguity. Marco did not argue for belief. He did not defend his credibility. He described. This restraint forced readers to assess plausibility independently. It also allowed the text to be appropriated by different agendas. The book's structure reinforced its adaptability. It did not follow a linear narrative arc focused on personal development. It grouped information by region, function, and system. This organization made it useful as reference. Sections could be read independently. Readers could extract what they needed. As copies spread, so did reputation. Marco Polo's name became associated with distance, access, and experience. This association did not elevate him to celebrity during his lifetime. It attached his identity to the text. He became a point of reference rather than a public figure. The book influenced cartography indirectly. Map makers incorporated information cautiously. Certain regions gained clearer outlines. Others remained speculative. The text did not provide coordinates. It provided relational understanding. Distances were described through travel time and route complexity rather than measurement. Language played a significant role in shaping reception. Translations introduced nuance shifts. Terms were adapted to local understanding. Marco's descriptions of administrative roles and institutions were rendered into familiar categories. This translation eased comprehension, but sometimes altered meaning. Despite variation, core themes persisted. The scale of Asia, the organization of Mongol administration, the integration of trade and governance, and the diversity of belief remained consistent. These elements distinguished the text from earlier travel accounts that emphasized marvel over structure. The book's longevity owed much to its timing. Europe stood at the edge of expanded exploration. Curiosity about the wider world was increasing. The text offered information without mythic framing. It did not promise treasure or salvation. It offered understanding. Over time, the book became part of a broader corpus of travel literature. It influenced how later travelers framed their observations. They adopted similar emphases on route, system, and function. Marco's restraint became a model, even when not acknowledged explicitly. The text also entered popular imagination. Stories derived from it circulated independently of the manuscript tradition. These retellings emphasized wonder more than accuracy. Marco's name attached itself to these narratives loosely. He did not intervene. The distance between Marco's intent and the text's impact widened as years passed. He remained aware of the book's circulation, but he did not guide its interpretation. This detachment preserved his orientation toward observation rather than legacy. Within Venice, the book's presence was muted. It did not immediately alter Marco's status. Venetian society valued current contribution over past experience. The book existed alongside Marco rather than defining him. Scholars debated its reliability. Some questioned specific claims, others defended the coherence of the account. The absence of overt self-promotion lent credibility. Marco did not present himself as hero. He presented systems. The book's endurance through centuries of copying reflected its utility. It did not become obsolete quickly. Systems described persisted long enough to remain relevant. Even when political conditions changed, the structural observations retained value. As printing emerged later, the text reached broader audiences. Standardization increased, but variation remained. Editors selected versions that aligned with contemporary interests. The book continued to adapt. The influence of the book extended beyond geography. It affected how Europeans conceived of governance. The idea that large, diverse populations could be administered efficiently challenged assumptions about political order. This conceptual shift mattered. The book also influenced attitudes toward trade. It reinforced the idea that wealth derived from exchange, supported by stability. This understanding aligned with emerging mercantile practices in Europe. Marco's account did not initiate exploration directly. It contributed to an environment in which exploration seemed plausible. It expanded imagination within bounds of description. The text's endurance owed much to its neutrality. It did not advocate conquest. It did not condemn difference. It described coexistence. This neutrality allowed readers to project their own interpretations. Marco himself remained peripheral to these developments. He did not lecture. He did not tour courts. He lived within Venice's rhythms. The book traveled farther than he did. Over time, Marco's name became symbolic. It represented access to the wider world. This symbolism did not reflect his lived experience precisely. It abstracted it. The book's influence persisted because it resisted closure. It did not resolve questions. It opened them. Readers returned to it seeking clarification rather than conclusion. The manuscript tradition preserved both accuracy and error. Copyists introduced mistakes. Others corrected them. This process reflected collective engagement. The text belonged to no single authority. As generations passed, the book became historical evidence as well as narrative. Scholars compared it with archaeological findings and later accounts. Many descriptions proved consistent. This consistency reinforced credibility retrospectively. Marco did not witness the full extent of this validation. His awareness of the book's reach remained limited. He understood it had traveled. He did not measure its distance. The book that traveled far did so because it moved within systems of exchange, intellectual as well as commercial. It mirrored the world it described. By the time Marco's life neared its end, the text had already detached from him. It existed independently, shaping perception without requiring his presence. This separation marked a quiet culmination. Marco's experience had been transformed into a shared reference point. The journey had extended beyond the traveller, legacy of distant worlds. The final years of Marco Polo's life unfolded without public distinction, without ceremony, and without any sense that he stood at the end of a historical arc. He lived within Venice as one citizen among many, shaped by obligations, commerce, and the quiet passage of time. The world he had traversed remained present in memory, but it did not dominate his days. His legacy, though already in motion, did not announce itself to him as such. It existed beyond his immediate awareness, carried forward by the systems of transmission he had long understood. Marco did not become a public authority on distant lands. He was not appointed to advise governments, nor did he lecture scholars. His experiences did not grant him a formal role in shaping policy or exploration. Venice, pragmatic as ever, assessed individuals by current utility. Marco participated in trade and civic life according to expectation. His past remained background rather than credential. The account associated with his name continued to circulate independently. It reached readers who never knew the man behind it. Over time, Marco Polo became less a living individual and more a reference point. His identity condensed into association with distance, access, and observation. This abstraction did not distort his experience so much as simplify it. The world Marco had described did not remain static. The Mongol Empire fragmented, administrative coherence weakened. Routes that had once been secure became uncertain. Some cities declined, others transformed. Yet the structures Marco had observed left traces. Systems of trade, communication, and governance influenced successor states. His descriptions preserved a snapshot of a particular moment of connectivity. The book's endurance lay partly in this timing. It captured a world at peak integration before dispersal. Later readers encountered it as evidence of what had existed, not merely as speculation. This temporal positioning enhanced its value. It recorded function rather than aspiration. Marco's restraint as an observer contributed to this durability. He had not framed his experiences as exceptional, he had described them as operational. This orientation allowed readers to extract insight rather than marvel. The text invited analysis rather than awe. Over generations, scholars compared Marco's descriptions with archaeological evidence, administrative records, and later travel accounts. Many of his observations aligned with independent sources. This consistency strengthened retrospective credibility. Skepticism did not vanish entirely, but it narrowed. The influence of Marco's account extended unevenly. It did not inspire immediate replication. Few Europeans possessed the means or political conditions to follow similar routes. Yet the idea that such routes existed and that they could be navigated through systems rather than chance mattered. It reshaped imagination within limits. Cartography evolved gradually. Mapmakers incorporated information cautiously. Marco's descriptions informed relative positioning rather than precise measurement. Over time, these relational understandings accumulated. The world on maps expanded not through sudden revelation, but through incremental adjustment. The conceptual impact extended beyond geography. Marco's account challenged European assumptions about governance. It demonstrated that large, diverse populations could be administered through information, delegation, and routine. This challenged the idea that scale necessarily produced chaos. The implication lingered. Trade theory also absorbed influence. Marco's emphasis on predictability, infrastructure, and trust resonated with emerging mercantile practice. His descriptions reinforced the idea that economic vitality depended on system design rather than individual accumulation. Cultural perception shifted subtly. Marco had described religious diversity coexisting under a single authority without constant conflict. This challenged narratives that equated difference with instability. The idea did not overturn prejudice, but it complicated it. Marco's legacy was thus diffuse. It did not belong to a single domain. It intersected geography, commerce, governance, and imagination. Its influence was cumulative rather than directive. Within Venice, Marco aged quietly. Records indicate participation in civic affairs and management of property. He married. He fulfilled obligations. There is no evidence that he revisited the narrative of his travels obsessively. He did not seek to refine or defend it publicly. As death approached, Marco did not frame his life as extraordinary. He prepared his affairs according to custom. In his will, he referenced property and obligation rather than experience. This orientation reflected his lifelong pragmatism. The famous assertion attributed to Marco that he had not told half of what he had seen has been debated. Whether spoken or later attributed, it reflects a broader truth. His account was selective by necessity. Observation always exceeded record. Memory always outpaced documentation. This selectivity did not diminish value. It reinforced reliability. Marco had chosen to describe systems he understood clearly rather than speculate beyond them. This restraint distinguished his legacy from myth. After his death, Marco Polo ceased to be a participant. His name continued to circulate. It became shorthand for exploration. Later generations projected ambition onto him that he had not expressed. They recast him as precursor to eras he did not imagine. This projection obscured aspects of his life while amplifying others. The patient observer became an emblem of daring. The administrative witness became a symbol of adventure. These reinterpretations reflected later needs rather than Marco's reality. Yet beneath these layers, the core of his contribution remained intact. He had described a connected world governed by systems. He had recorded function without ornament. These qualities survived reinterpretation. The endurance of Marco's legacy also reflected a broader human need to understand how distant societies organize life. His account provided a template for such understanding. It demonstrated that difference could be approached through observation rather than judgment. In this sense, Marco's legacy was methodological. He modeled a way of seeing. He paid attention. He described without exaggeration. He accepted complexity without reduction. This approach transcended content. The modern world, connected at scale, unimaginable in Marco's time, often mirrors conditions, he observed: reliance on information flow, infrastructure, and coordination. Readers continue to recognize these patterns in his account. Marco did not foresee this continuity. He did not anticipate global frameworks. He described what he saw. The relevance emerged later. His life illustrates how significance can arise without intention. He did not seek to define eras. He participated in systems. His observations persisted because they were grounded. The distant worlds Marco described are no longer distant in the same way, yet the act of bridging distance through understanding remains relevant. Marco's account reminds readers that connectivity depends on structure and patience. In the end, Marco Polo's legacy does not rest on where he went, but on how he paid attention while there. He moved through the world as a participant rather than a conqueror, as an observer rather than a judge. The systems he described have changed. The approach he modeled endures. And with that understanding, the journey concludes not with spectacle, but with continuity.